Chapter 2867. Luo Fan actually attached great importance to the will of the world. This could be seen from how much effort he had put in for the birth of the will of the world. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how he felt when the will of the world was instantly destroyed by the invisible will. However, no matter how much he felt, the will of the world had already been broken down into its essence, even if he didn't want to see it, of course. He didn't have much time to feel sad about the disappearance of the will of the world. Because at this moment, the endless waves of tribulations were swarming towards him and were about to drown him. After the waves of tribulations, there were still some remnants in the perfect world. In fact, after the power of the tribulations, what was left in the perfect world was the essence of the perfect world. Or rather, it was the essence in Luo Fan's eyes, the perfect characteristic of the perfect world. The mysterious perfection quality spread all over the remnants of the perfect world, like an invisible network that replaced the original perfect world. Amidst the endless power of the tribulations in the tribulation level, a rough outline of a perfect world was vaguely drawn. Although the invisible will had used a method to completely transform the perfect world into its essence, it still hadn't destroyed the most valuable existence in the perfect world, of course. This might also be because destroying this perfect trait would cause quite a bit of damage to the existence itself. Don't forget that the invisible will itself wasn't the true will of the tribulations, nor was it a will that simulated the state of chaos. Its own existence was actually an indescribable concept in the tribulations, or simulated the state of chaos that was thrown into the perfect world. It was just a will that was born after it, combined with the countless body parts that the former worlds will had scattered into. Such an existence obviously needed two fulcrums. The first was naturally the source of the concept, which might be the existence of the tribulations, or simulated the state of chaos. The second was the body parts of the former world's will. Without either of these two fulcrums, the invisible will wouldn't be able to exist. Therefore, no matter how the invisible will wanted to deal with the world and how it wanted to return the world to the power of the tribulations, it couldn't harm the body parts of the former world's will. At the very least, he couldn't destroy the essence of these body parts. The essence of many body parts of the former worlds was clearly entrusted to this perfect world. Without the existence of the perfect world itself, these body parts would not be able to exist. In other words, no matter what, this perfect world needed to retain a bit of existence for the body parts of the former worlds will to be entrusted. Clearly, nothing was more appropriate than leaving behind these perfect traits at this moment. The value of these perfect qualities was even higher than the perfect heaven and earth itself. If there was anything in the perfect heaven and earth that should be destroyed in the end, it was clearly more valuable than that. That was why such a situation had occurred. At this moment, the formless will itself had already used various methods that Luo Fan could not understand to transfer the body parts that were sealed in countless spaces to the perfect trait. At this moment, the boundless space-time had been completely devoured by the tribulations. All the structures and existences had been completely converted into the power of the tribulations and were absorbed into the tribulations. At this moment, Luo Fan was completely within the wave of tribulation energy. His entire body, his line of sight, and his senses were all covered by the tribulation energy that was surging madly. Fortunately, his incarnation was entrusted with a trace of power related to a true sage. Otherwise, just this kind of scouring would have completely destroyed his incarnation in the first place. Of course, being able to reach this level was already his limit at this moment. His clone was indeed able to remain unscathed amidst the endless waves of tribulations, but he could only protect himself. It was impossible for him to do anything else given the current situation. Die, the invisible will said softly at this moment. This voice was even louder than before, and the shock to one's soul was even more intense. At this moment, Luo Fan even felt that his soul was going to be shaken to the point of collapse. Immediately after, a mysterious power that could penetrate one's soul began to separate from the tribulation's power. Through the shock caused by the voice, it began to enter his soul and spread along his soul. It began to make his soul gradually sink into an indescribable and strange state. It was as if there were countless strange insects nibbling at his soul at every moment, but he could not struggle at all. He could only watch as these insects gradually nibbled away everything that existed in his soul. The tribulation's power itself was all-encompassing. In it, there were powers that targeted all kinds of existences, let alone powers that targeted the soul. However, it turned out that these powers were unable to break through the power related to a true divine for Luo Fan's incarnation. In this way, these powers that targeted the soul would naturally not be able to break through his defense and harm his soul. However, the situation was different now. Currently, Luo Fan's soul had been shaken by the words spoken by the invisible will, which meant that the defense of his soul had been bypassed by the other party through some unimaginable means. Under such circumstances, this shock was equivalent to a breakthrough point. In the hands of the invisible will, it was enough to erupt with an unimaginable effect. In the end, the power that targeted the soul was directly sent into Luo Fan's soul and began to directly attack him on the spiritual level. Judging from the current situation, the effect of this attack was obviously quite powerful. Faced with this situation, within the power related to a true divine, Luo Fan's real body tightly knitted his brows. Right now, he could clearly see the soul attack that his incarnation was enduring. He had an accurate understanding of what would happen next. If he ignored it, the trace of power that his incarnation had entrusted to him would not be damaged, but his incarnation, which was entrusted to that trace of power, would be completely erased. Moreover, because of the spiritual connection, the kind of power that targeted the spiritual will directly float up, directly into the mind of his true body, and began to attack the mind of his true body. Perhaps in the end, his true body would also suffer a calamity. In the face of this situation, he had two solutions. The first one was naturally to help his incarnation resist the power of the soul. As long as his incarnation could completely resist and eliminate the power that completely targeted the soul that was extracted from the tribulation power, he would naturally be able to sit back and relax. The second one was to give up on his incarnation. At this time, he could directly cut off the connection between his real body and his incarnation. Once this connection was severed, any damage to him would only be limited to his clone. His real body would not be harmed at all. Obviously, Luo Fan was more looking forward to using the first method. After all, cutting off all the disaster at his incarnation and eliminating the power of the soul would not only protect his incarnation, but also represent that he had achieved a stage victory in this battle. Although severing the connection between his true body and his incarnation seemed quick and convenient, it didn't just mean that he would inevitably lose his incarnation. It also meant that he was helpless against a power that targeted his soul. He had suffered a complete failure. What a powerful method. No wonder it's the incarnation of the tribulation stage, or the will that simulated the state of chaos. Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim inwardly. The invisible and intangible will wasn't the real tribulation stage, or the will that simulated the state of chaos. However, as the combination of the mysterious concept and the body and mind of the previous world's will, it wasn't inaccurate to say that it was the tribulation stage or the will that simulated the state of chaos. After exclaiming in admiration, he began to quickly send a large amount of willpower from his main body to the incarnation through the connection between his main body and his incarnation. At this time, the power related to the true divine still existed in the core position of the perfect world. And this position was actually the core of the mysterious perfection in the entire perfect world. Although the entire perfect world had undergone earth-shattering changes at this time, it seemed that even the world no longer existed. However, for the power related to the true divine, everything seemed to be the same as before. It didn't change at all because of the earth-shattering changes in the perfect world around it. It was still as stable and calm as before, as if nothing had happened and nothing had changed. The reason for this was obviously that the changes in front of it weren't enough to change it. for this power that was related to true divine. The reason why it had stayed in this perfect world was obviously because of the perfect characteristic that existed in this perfect world that was given by the simulated chaotic state. It could be said that even if the perfect world looked so mysterious and perfect in every aspect, it was obviously not as good as the power that had been added to the perfect world. But now, everything in this perfect world and this power that wasn't pleasing to its eyes had been destroyed. However, the power that was pleasing to its eyes and the characteristics of perfection still remained. In this situation, to this power, it was as if nothing had changed. In this way, the power naturally couldn't change because of this. After receiving the endless willpower from his main body, Luo Fan's incarnation suddenly broke free from the shock of the voice. As he broke free from the shock of the voice, he instantly felt that the countless insects that were gnawing at him seemed to have become much fewer. The originally unstoppable attack seemed to no longer be so absolute. With a thought, he roused his spirit, and a mysterious wave of spirit force swept out. In the blink of an eye, the countless insects were wiped out, and his spirit became relaxed again. At the same time, the power related to the true divine that his incarnation had entrusted to him instantly surged. An indescribable wave of spirit force was released. In the face of this fluctuation, the tribulation waves in the surroundings instantly collapsed in large swathes. During this process of collapse, space-time after space-time appeared in the surroundings. They piled up and began to frantically devour the endless power of the tribulations in the surroundings, gradually emptying out a large area without the power of the tribulations. In the face of such a change, the formless will seem to be a little surprised. You actually blocked it? My method just now was completely designed to target your weakness. Normally, you shouldn't have been able to block it, it said. His words still contained a profound feeling that could shake one's heart. However, this time, this mysterious power couldn't really shake Luo Fan's will, nor could it shake his spirit. At this moment, Luo Fan also clearly felt how this indescribable power worked. At this moment, there were clearly countless strands of consciousness being released from the voice. These strands of consciousness, through some indescribable and mysterious changes, devoured a part of his mind and affected a part of his will. Through this devouring and influence, the various subtle powers contained in the voice spread to his entire mind and soul, thus achieving the effect of affecting his entire mind and soul. These changes were extremely fast, almost surpassing the speed at which his will circulated. Previously, because it came so quickly, even Luo Fan didn't have the time to react. He was already affected by it and was thoroughly shocked. That was why he didn't feel this process at all. But now, due to the great increase in his willpower, he was able to resist the influence of the sound. This allowed him to clearly feel the effect of the sound on him. Looks like you've been studying me for a long time. Luo Fan couldn't help but shudder. Chapter 2868. If one wanted to have such a deep understanding of Luo Fan, it was obvious that one had to pay attention to him. Moreover, it could not be just ordinary attention. After all, many of Luo Fan's methods had always been subtle and unfathomable. If one only looked at him in general, one might not be able to see anything. One had to attach great importance to him and pay attention to him for a long time in order to have such a deep understanding of Luo Fan. At the thought that there was some kind of existence paying attention to him at all times, and that this continued for hundreds of millions of years, yet he was completely unaware of it, Luo Fan felt his hair stand on end. He felt as if all of his secrets had been pulled out. However, Luo Fan was Luo Fan after all. The creepy feeling soon disappeared from his heart. Although he still minded the fact that he was being watched by someone, this sort of minding could no longer affect his rationality, and he could no longer lose control of his body. At that moment, he calmed himself down. His eyes flickered, and he looked at the perfect characteristic of the perfect world. The perfect characteristic represented the invisible and intangible willpower at this moment. For the willpower, because it was invisible and intangible, even Luo Fan could not see its existence directly. After all, if it could still be said to be formless and intangible at this level, it clearly meant that its formless and intangible nature was almost absolute. At least, it was almost absolute for Luo Fan. Therefore, it was obvious that at this moment, facing this almost absolute formless and intangible willpower, Luo Fan could not directly see the true body of the willpower. He could only recognize the willpower through where it was currently residing. The various body parts of the former world's willpower that the formless and intangible willpower resided in were now entrusted with the perfect characteristic of the perfect world that was the only thing left in the endless waves of tribulations. At this moment, a voice entered Luo Fan's ears. It was the voice of the formless and intangible willpower. Is this very strange? Don't you know your own situation? In this simulated chaotic state, apart from that force, who else is the most special other than you? If I don't even pay attention to you, how would I be qualified to exist? Hearing these words, the doubts in Luo Fan's heart were not resolved. After all, although he was special and could be said to be the root of the existence of this simulated chaotic state, this was only in essence. However, this was only in essence. Normally speaking, in this simulated state of chaos, he was equivalent to a slightly capable creator of the world. Normally speaking, the possibility of the incarnation of the will at the tribulation level, or the will that simulated chaotic state, noticing him was not high. However, he understood in his heart that there was no longer any meaning in being conflicted over this matter. At present, the most important thing to him was that the will incarnation in the tribulation level, or the will incarnation that simulated the state of chaos, understood him very well. Moreover, it was standing against him, intending to get rid of him first before welcoming its own unpredictable fate. Under such circumstances, what Luo Fan should do now was obviously to deal with the current predicament, and not to delve into the cause of this predicament. For the current Luo Fan, almost everything he had could no longer be relied on to resist this will. Although he was confident, he knew that there was still a long way to go before he could reach perfection. Therefore, he definitely had all kinds of weaknesses. These weaknesses might be subtle, obscure, or just imperfect in certain details. However, in a battle of this level, these weaknesses were enough to become a breakthrough point for the opponent to attack. This was especially so when the invisible will in front of him had shown that it could use these weaknesses to form a strange attack that he could not defend against. In this situation, unless Luo Fan had enough strength to suppress everything, like those who were weaker than him, otherwise he could only go around these weaknesses and prevent them from being used by his opponent. And obviously, the situation at this time was that Luo Fan did not have enough strength to suppress that invisible and intangible will. So, what he could do now was obviously not to rush over rashly and fight that shapeless and immaterial will, and he had to search for an existence that could suppress that shapeless and immaterial will. Fortunately, he could find it. The invisible will was either the incarnation of the will of the tribulation level, or the will that simulated the state of chaos. This meant that it could at least mobilize part of the energy of the tribulation level, or simulated the state of chaos, or rather, part of its power. This part, no matter how large the proportion, was enough to destroy the world. For any creator of the world, it could be said to be a power that was close to a fatal blow. This could be seen from the fact that the perfect world could not even last for an instant before it was completely turned into a part of the tribulation wave. However, this did not mean that Luo Fan, who was in the tribulation level, had no way out. In fact, the location of his real body was his best way out. No matter how strong and terrifying the state of chaos in the tribulation level was, it was only derived from Luo Fan's own realm and was only targeted at the changes of the Great Tribulation. The source of its birth determined its essence, and it could not surpass Luo Fan by too much. Even if it was much stronger than Luo Fan in terms of quantity, changes, and means, its essence was still its essence. Even with so many advantages, it could not change the fact that it was only at the seventh tribulation level. This essence determined that it would be extremely powerless when facing the force related to the true saint. It was just like how Luo Fan had spent so much time and even risked his life to get into it. At this time, there were still hidden dangers, and he could only borrow a trace of that force to entrust his incarnation. If it was another existence, the effort that Luo Fan had spent to get into that force would probably be enough to completely change that existence in a countless worlds of laws. Luo Fan was like that when facing the force related to the true saint, and it was the same for other existences at the same level as him. And now, compared to the simulated state of chaos or the tribulation level, Luo Fan's advantage was that he had completed the initial connection with the force related to the true saint. At the very least, he could already use a trace of that force. Moreover, this was obviously sufficient to allow this energy to become his greatest reliance against this invisible will. Since you know me so well, you should know that my fundamental goal is to transcend this simulated state of chaos. We don't necessarily have to be enemies. However, although he had already made up his mind, he still said so. He still wanted to test the other party's determination. If it's possible, you won't see me, the invisible will said faintly. The voice was still constantly crashing into Luo Fan's mind through various subtle and indescribable methods. It constantly reverberated in his heart, trying to resonate with his mind and establish some kind of indescribable connection channel. However, at this time, Luo Fan had the support of the will transmitted by his main body. Whenever the will of the incarnation wavered, the will would naturally make up for it. Naturally, the incarnation's will was impenetrable during the process of the transmission of the voice. No matter how the voice searched and resonated, there wasn't the slightest change. Why is this necessary? Luo Fan immediately sighed. At this moment, his incarnation trembled slightly, and a strand of power was suddenly extracted from his body. As this strand of power was extracted, his body became even more blurry, as if he had become an invisible shadow. Of course, in the end, he still maintained the general appearance of the incarnation. The strand of power that was extracted condensed in his hand, and in the blink of an eye, it had turned into a three-legged cauldron. As the three-legged cauldron was born, an incredible suppressive force instantly spread out from its body, and in the blink of an eye, it had already frozen the space that Luo Fan had constructed. In the blink of an eye, this space and time was like a mosquito frozen in amber, unable to move an inch. The suppressive force didn't stop there. Instead, it spread out further, gradually freezing the surging waves of tribulations in the outside world. Under the suppressive force, time was also within the scope of the suppressive force. Therefore, there is no longer the word time to describe how long the suppressive force lasted. In fact, the concept of how long did not exist at this moment. Of course, Luo Fan was a living being, and the time in the outside world could be suppressed, and the concept of lasting time could become meaningless. However, as a living being, his senses needed the concept of time to measure the development of everything in the outside world. This was also the limitation of a living being's will. Even if Luo Fan could equate 100 trillion years with an instant, he couldn't truly break free from the shackles of time. In this state where even time in the outside world was suppressed, in his perception, it seemed like it had lasted for billions of years, but also like it had only lasted for an instant. By the time he recovered from the inexplicable contradiction, the endless waves of tribulations that filled the place where the perfect heaven and earth used to be had been completely subdued. Not even the slightest tremor existed. Moreover, in a large area outside the original location of the perfect world, the power of the tribulations had been frozen. The closer it was to the original location of the perfect world, the slower it flowed. When it came into contact with the original location of the perfect world, the power of the tribulations was completely frozen, and the further out it went, the more active the power of the tribulations became. Only when it reached an area that was about twice the original size of the perfect world did the power of the tribulations return to its normal state, Just its birth already had such great power. So one could imagine the power of the three-legged cauldron. And the essence of the three-legged cauldron was clearly just a strand of the power related to the true saint. Just this alone was already so unimaginable. Thus, it went without saying how powerful it was. Of course, although it seemed that it was just condensing the power into the shape of the three-legged cauldron, the process was not easy at all. This could be seen from the fact that Luo Fan's incarnation had almost completely disappeared after he condensed the three-legged cauldron. Although the essence of the power was beyond imagination, it was impossible for it to reach the point of possessing such incredible power just by changing its shape. Perhaps some powers would have such power, but at the very least, the power that Luo Fan had encountered and controlled did not have such power. The reason why the power could have such power after changing its shape was naturally because it was not just the shape that had changed. There were all sorts of indescribable runes densely packed within the three-legged cauldron. As they fused with each other, they formed an extremely complicated structure that eventually formed the three-legged cauldron. It could be said that the unimaginable power displayed by the three-legged cauldron was due to the mysterious characteristics of the power itself, but it was also due to the countless complicated rune structures within the three-legged cauldron. It was the structure of these runes that mobilized the mysterious characteristics of the power itself, allowing the special characteristics that could originally only be released in countless directions and on countless levels to gather in one place and transform into a suppressive power. That was how it created such an earth-shattering effect at this moment. The perfect characteristics were clearly within the range that was completely suppressed. In this way, it could be said that in just an instant, just the construction of the three-legged cauldron had already largely suppressed the carrier of the invisible and intangible will. I can actually control a little of that power. The invisible and intangible will sighed at this moment. The voice seemed to have lost a lot of its magical effects. Although it could still directly enter one's heart and appear directly in Luo Fan's mind, the powerful attack that it had displayed previously was no longer there. Obviously, this suppression did not have no effect on the invisible and intangible will at all. Fortunately, I can control a little. Luo Fan's expression did not relax at this moment, and he merely said faintly. Chapter 2869. At this moment, the perfect trait started to squirm slightly. This kind of squirming was nothing much under normal circumstances. After all, the perfect trait was an extremely ingenious and perfect collection of balance mechanisms. It was naturally impossible for the balance mechanism to be perfect without any changes. Under normal circumstances, it was not uncommon for such a balance mechanism to be overturned and turn into something completely different in the blink of an eye, let alone squirming. However, at this moment, the appearance of this squirming had a completely different meaning. It must be known that the perfect trait had been completely suppressed by the three-legged cauldron formed by the power related to a true sage. Although this suppression was not unleashed by the three-legged cauldron at full power, it was still enough to completely suppress the perfect world and even affect an area twice as large as this. Yet, even under such a terrifying suppressive force, the perfect trait was still able to squirm. This clearly meant that the perfect trait, or rather, the invisible will behind the perfect trait, had already transcended the suppressive force. In the face of such a wriggling movement, Luo Fan naturally couldn't just watch it escape. With a thought, the three-legged cauldron instantly trembled, and a suppression power that was more than 10 times stronger than before was instantly released. This time, the suppressive force didn't spread outwards endlessly. Instead, it started to shrink from the area that was originally twice as large as that of the perfect world. It shrunk within the range of the perfect world. More specifically, it shrank to the area where the perfect trait was located. Due to this shrinkage, the tribulation power outside of this area was no longer affected by the suppression power of the three-legged cauldron, and it returned to its normal operating state. At this moment, the wiggling of the perfect trait suddenly paused and then stopped once more. At this moment, an inexplicable light flashed in Luo Fan's eyes. The three-legged cauldron shook slightly, and the suppressive force instantly penetrated deep into the interior of the perfect trait, directly penetrating inside and out, up and down. Immediately after, a muffled groan was heard. This was still the voice of the invisible will. However, compared to before, this voice was even more ordinary and ordinary. Although the three-legged cauldron was essentially that power, due to Luo Fan's rearrangement and reconstruction, it had actually turned into a magic treasure. Moreover, it was a magic treasure that was completely refined by Luo Fan. It was a magic treasure that had completely fused with his mind. With such a magic treasure, he could naturally entrust his mind to it. Compared to directly attaching his incarnation to the power related to the true divine, this seemed to be an intermediate stage, and there was not much difference in essence. But in reality, the difference between the two was like heaven and earth. Placing his embodiment on this power was simply using this power to protect his embodiment. It could be said that this power was just a protective shield for himself. However, now that he had turned this power into a magic treasure and placed his mind on it, he had turned this power into a weapon and used its power to achieve his desired goal. Under such circumstances, when he placed his mind on this magic treasure, Luo Fan's embodiment instantly felt that his senses had been greatly extended. The invisible will, which was originally invisible, was finally exposed to his senses. The perfect trait, which was originally just a collection of various balancing mechanisms, also showed more layers and more mysteries because of the extension of his senses. In his opinion, the perfect trait had only one layer, although it could be divided into countless balancing mechanisms. In general, these countless balancing mechanisms still formed an almost inseparable whole. It was possible to forcibly separate it, but once it was separated, it would no longer be a perfect trait, and that kind of perfection would disappear without a trace. However, now that his senses had been extended, he realized that the trait of perfection in front of him was divided into countless layers. Each balancing mechanism was a small, perfect trait. These countless small balancing mechanisms were connected together, or rather, countless small perfect traits were combined together, forming an even larger perfect trait in front of Luo Fan at this moment. And at this moment, within the countless tiny perfect traits, there was a part of the invisible and intangible will scattered and stored. No, after Luo Fan extended his senses with the help of the three-legged cauldron, the will could no longer be called invisible. Now, the will could only be called a tribulation level, or an incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos. Many details of these incarnations of the will corresponded to the many parts of the body and mind of the former worlds will that Luo Fan had suppressed previously. Every detail seemed to correspond to a body and mind part, because they were scattered and hidden in the internal layers of the perfect trait that Luo Fan could not detect. Luo Fan could not discover their existence before, and felt that they were invisible and intangible at this moment. Countless indescribable spiritual lights continuously flowed and jumped between the countless small perfect traits and finally gathered into a clear whole of the will, which was the thoughts and psychological activities of the incarnation of the will. "I finally see you," Luo Fan said indifferently. At this moment, as the spiritual lights flashed, a voice came from the perfect trait. "Is that so? So what if you see me?" At this moment, countless spiritual lights appeared out of nowhere in the depths of the countless perfect traits. Along with these spiritual lights, there was also the unimaginable power of tribulations. The power of the countless tribulations erupted from the depths of the perfect trait and gathered towards the countless spiritual lights. In the blink of an eye, it had already wrapped around the spiritual lights and became the support of the spiritual lights. In the end, the spiritual lights suddenly increased by 1,000 times. The spiritual lights previously looked like tiny specks of light, but now these specks of light had already turned into moons in front of Luo Fan. Although they were still quite far from the sun, the light was already completely incomparable to before. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron began to tremble slightly. This was a reaction from the suppressive power receiving a powerful backlash. After all, the suppressive power came from the three-legged cauldron. Under such circumstances, the suppressive power was suppressed and obstructed, and there would naturally be a corresponding feedback landing on the three-legged cauldron. Immediately after, the perfect trait began to tremble slightly, and it slowly shrank. From the way it shrank, it seemed like it was going to shrink to a point and become a condensed body, so that all the power it possessed would be unified. At this moment, an indescribable wave suddenly appeared out of nowhere and instantly swept across the perfect trait. As this wave appeared, a miserable shriek was heard from the incarnation of will. At this moment, through the extended senses of the three-legged cauldron, Luo Fan did not know how many spiritual lights within the perfect trait had been completely extinguished. Luo Fan was taken aback at first, and then he came to a sudden realization. A faint smile appeared on his face. I see. It's not that easy to snatch what it has its eyes on. The power that he was referring to was none other than the power that was related to the true divine. In this simulated state of chaos, the only thing that could make the incarnation of the will of the tribulation level or the incarnation of the will of the simulated state of chaos suffer such a great loss was obviously the power related to the true divine. After thinking about what the incarnation of will was trying to do, one could naturally understand why it would trigger a backlash from the power related to the true divine. It must be known that the power related to the true divine had appeared here because of the existence of the perfect trait. Therefore, this perfect trait could be said to be something that the power related to the true divine had its eyes on. Under such circumstances, the incarnation of will actually wanted to condense the perfect trait and transform it into some kind of power, some kind of method, and some kind of reliance that it could control. Wasn't this equivalent to depriving the power related to the true divine of its control over the perfect trait? Wouldn't that make the act of that force coming here meaningless? How could the power agree to such a thing? In this case, the appearance of the completely unimaginable wave just now was naturally a matter of course. At this moment, Luo Fan, who understood this, did not let down his guard. Instead, he instantly activated the three-legged cauldron that was formed by the power related to the true divine. With a slight tremble, the powerful suppression force that was originally released underwent some subtle changes. During this change, a large amount of spiritual light that had not been extinguished before was instantly wrapped up at this moment. Then, as the spiritual light suddenly shrank, it became extremely dark and gloomy, as if it was going to be completely extinguished. During this process, the boundless power of the tribulation that was guided over by the spirit light didn't seem to exist at all. It didn't react at all, let alone help the spirit light break free from the pressure of the suppressive power. Another scream came from the perfect trait. Then the perfect trait loosened slightly, and in the blink of an eye, it expanded back to its original state due to the relaxed impact force. In other words, it was once again in the state of the perfect world. It seemed that the incarnation of will had disappeared. If Luo Fan's senses had not been expanded by the three-legged cauldron, he might have believed this. However, it was obvious that his senses had been expanded. Therefore, it was impossible for him to misunderstand the appearance in front of him. At this moment, he could clearly see that there were still specks of spiritual light within the perfect trait. Even though these spiritual lights looked extremely dark and gloomy, they could not change the fact that these spiritual lights still existed. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but frown slightly. Even so, he was still unable to completely extinguish the spiritual lights and destroy the incarnation of will. This was out of his expectations. At this moment, the spiritual lights suddenly flashed and disappeared without a trace. This disappearance made Luo Fan's heart tremble. This method of disappearing was completely different from what he had expected. This kind of disappearance was not the kind that was completely extinguished or erased. Instead, it was like the disappearance of some tentacles that had been completely removed after achieving some goal. At this moment, a world that was billions of times vaster than the perfect world instantly appeared around Luo Fan's body. Not only did it completely envelop the perfect trait, but it also enveloped the huge wave of tribulation power around the perfect trait. In this brand new world, the wave of tribulation power was like an ocean. As the waves surged, it erupted with terrifying destructive power that could destroy the world. That perfect trait was like an island in the middle of the ocean. It was a little special, but it was incomparably small compared to the ocean. At this moment, a huge and unparalleled will appeared above Luo Fan's head, looking down at Luo Fan with a condescending attitude. This will gave off an aura that Luo Fan was very familiar with. It was the aura of the previous incarnation of the tribulation level, or the incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos. Of course, at the same time, there was also an aura that belonged to the world's will. Obviously, this was the incarnation of the will from before. At the same time, it was also the world's will of this brand new world. At this moment, this will was billions of times stronger than the incarnation of the will from before. It felt like the aura that it gave off had the same suppressive effect as the three-legged cauldron. Under the shroud of that aura, Luo Fan actually felt like his body had become stagnant, as if he had become unable to move. At the same time, in the simulated state of chaos, or rather, in the simulated state of chaos outside the tribulation level, everything suddenly realized that the simulated state of chaos seemed to have undergone some subtle changes. The heavens and earth where the tribulations had yet to descend felt that the signs of the tribulations that they had sensed had suddenly disappeared without a trace. As for the worlds that were originally in the midst of the tribulation, they suddenly realized that the tribulation had suddenly disappeared into thin air, as if it had never appeared. Chapter 2870. What's going on? Why is there such a change all of a sudden? In the transportation network layer, the perfect world pioneer was bewildered. Compared to ordinary pioneers of the world, he had a deeper understanding of simulating the state of chaos, and quickly figured out what this strange change meant. He immediately turned his senses and probed the source of the tribulations in the simulated chaos. With his heightened senses, he finally saw what the source of the tribulations looked like. The moment he saw the source of the tribulations, he was dumbfounded. At this moment, in the simulated chaos, there were many world pioneers who were just as dumbfounded as he was. They were the world pioneers who saw what they called the source of the tribulations, what they believed to be the layer of the tribulations, or what they believed to be the indescribable source of the tribulations. The reason for this was that at this moment, the indescribable existence in their eyes, or the source of the tribulations, had completely changed. It had transformed from an indescribable existence into a world of its own. This world was vast and boundless, and any world that had appeared in the simulated chaos was as small as a speck of dust compared to it. This world suppressed everything, and even the simulated chaos layer was so small and insignificant compared to it. It was just like at this moment, in the eyes of the perfect world pioneer, the world that he had opened up was like a wave in that world. And the transportation network layer that this world was on was just like a small island in that world. After being dumbfounded for a long time, the perfect world pioneer paused slightly. He suddenly sensed an indescribable sense of familiarity from that world. It was as if there was some element in that world that he was extremely familiar with. This was not because he had directly grasped the aura of the world, nor was it because he had probed the world with his own senses. Instead, it was purely because he had discovered some familiar traces when he looked at the world with his own eyes. There are traces of me opening up a world. In an instant, the perfect world pioneer was dumbfounded. He felt as if his soul could no longer withstand the information he had received. How was this possible? After all, even though the world he'd created earlier was a perfect world, and it could be considered to be at the peak of the universe, it had been destroyed by the tribulation in the end. How could he see the traces of that heaven and earth in such a great heaven and earth? It was like a person who had lost a wallet but when he found it again, he found that the wallet was being sold at an astronomical price in an auction. The creator of the perfect world naturally did not believe his senses. After all, no one would easily believe that their lost wallet was really that valuable. However, it was clear that the perfect world creator had a way to confirm if what he sensed was real. Although the perfect heaven and earth had been devoured by the tribulation level, the connection between it and him had been completely severed. However, in the end, it was still a world that he had opened up, and he had nurtured it from the very beginning to the final state of perfection. It could be said that there was absolutely no one in the universe that could surpass him in terms of understanding of the perfect world. If that wasn't the case, he wouldn't have been able to recognize the traces of the perfect world in that world. Since he had such a deep understanding of the perfect heaven and earth, how could he not think of a way to test it when he could see it directly? For ordinary mortals, there was a world of difference between seeing something and touching it. It was just like a mortal who could directly see the stars in the sky, and could even see the starlight that was emitted from billions of light years away through instruments. However, it was very clear that unless there was a huge change, it was almost impossible for him to truly touch the star that he was looking at, who knew how many billions of light years away. This was the limitation of mortals. However, this kind of limitation was not absolute for cultivators. Although not all cultivators were free from this restriction, the stronger a cultivator was, the smaller the restriction they would be subjected to. When one's strength reached the level of a perfect heaven and earth creator, the influence of this limitation on cultivators would be weakened to a certain extent. In other words, for a perfect heaven and earth creator, although the distance between seeing and touching wasn't small, it could be easily crossed. At this moment, although he could only use his own eyes to see that indescribably great world, this kind of observation already meant that he was not far from directly touching that world. It could even be said that, to him, seeing it represented a certain way of touching it. Since he could touch it, then it wasn't difficult for him to test the reaction of the heaven and earth through all kinds of touch and various methods. At this moment, his eyes narrowed. Through the connection of his sight, he sent an invisible existence directly to that world that he couldn't understand. Although that world was so vast, it looked like a boundless ocean on the whole. In the middle of the ocean, there were many islands shrouded in dense fog. These islands didn't seem to be a part of the ocean. Instead, they seemed to be existences that the ocean wanted to destroy, enduring the impact of the ocean again and again. Although there were traces of a perfect heaven and earth in the entire world, the most obvious one was one of the islands. It was an island with the densest fog and the strongest rejection from the ocean. It also withstood the impact of the waves much faster than the other islands. On that island, he could sense traces of a perfect heaven and earth that were more than 10 times denser than the other islands. Under such circumstances, was there a need to explain why a perfect heaven and earth creator would send that indescribable existence to that world? In an instant, the fog on the island that seemed to be the most rejected by the ocean began to surge strangely. As it surged, an indescribable aura began to seep out. It was an aura that could only be sensed by a perfect heaven and earth creator. It was an aura that belonged to him. Although the aura only appeared for an instant before it completely disappeared in the boundless fog, it was enough for the perfect heaven and earth creator to make a judgment. He was completely certain that there were indeed traces of the perfect heaven and earth that he had opened up before. After confirming this, the perfect heaven and earth creator was both sad and happy. He was naturally happy that the perfect heaven and earth that he had opened up had such incredible potential and could actually be used on such an indescribably great world. On the other hand, he was sad that he had completely lost that world at this moment. His mood was like that of a mortal who had confirmed that the wallet that had been auctioned for a sky-high price really belonged to him in the past. A mixture of sadness and joy. At this moment, in the core of the transportation network layer, in the world of laws, a voice suddenly sounded out and directly entered the ears of the perfect heaven and earth creator. Are you extremely regretful? This voice came from his incarnation, or rather, his former incarnation. The perfect heaven and earth creator was slightly shocked. He came back to his senses and said with a rather complicated expression, "You actually completely severed the connection with me." At this moment, his eyes pierced through the endless obstacles and directly shone on the world of laws at the core of the transportation network layer. At this moment, a humanoid figure appeared outside the world of laws. The humanoid figure did not conform to the aesthetic standards of the perfect heaven and earth creator at all, but it exuded an indescribable charm of perfection, making the perfect heaven and earth creator feel that this form was extremely perfect, harmonious, and charming. Obviously, it was the appearance of a connate Tao body of a certain world. After all, it was an incarnation that he had condensed. Although it had been distorted and changed again and again, the perfect heaven and earth creator still recognized it and confirmed that it was the incarnation that he had lost. "You actually dare to leave the world of laws?" Seeing this figure, the perfect heaven and earth creator was stunned. He had originally thought that the incarnation would at most show an image of himself, but he did not expect that his real body would actually leave the world of laws. Could it be that he was tired of living? At this moment, his heart moved slightly. His body was wrapped in endless power, and he had already crossed the endless paths in an instant. He appeared directly in front of the incarnation and casually slapped towards it. At this moment, the incarnation of the perfect heaven and earth creator only smiled faintly. He did not move at all, but the terrifying power that was crushing towards him instantly disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared in the first place. Immediately afterward, he casually slapped the perfect heaven and earth creator away. It looked like an ordinary person who had encountered a powerful opponent that he could not resist and was easily slapped away. The destructive aura from before was nowhere to be found. At this moment, the perfect heaven and earth creator only wondered if he was dreaming. This was clearly an incarnation that he had split out. Although everything had changed, it was impossible for its level to have increased by too much. Why did it already have the strength to devour him in such a short period of time? Although in the eyes of the incarnation of the perfect heaven and earth creator, he had already stayed in the parallel universe of the world of laws for who knows how many billions of years. However, because the flow of time was different, for the perfect heaven and earth creator, it was actually only a few days. Compared to his incomparably long and almost eternal life, what difference was there between a few days and the blink of an eye? However, in such a short period of time that was not much different from the blink of an eye, his incarnation had already overtaken him. How could he not be shocked? "What exactly did you get from there?" the perfect heaven and earth creator said in disbelief. At this moment, he had already stabilized his body. Although he had been easily slapped away in the battle with the previous incarnation and seemed to have become a mortal without much strength, he was still not a mortal after all. After all, he was the almost omnipotent heaven and earth creator that could split heaven and earth apart. With a slight adjustment, the sorry state he was in naturally disappeared completely. All sorts of mysterious and profound feelings once again appeared on his body. "I have obtained a brighter future and the strength to completely destroy you." The previous incarnation smiled slightly. Suddenly, a strong fighting spirit flashed in his eyes. Although he said that he wanted to destroy the perfect heaven and earth creator, it was obvious that the previous incarnation actually did not have much killing intent towards the perfect heaven and earth creator. Although the perfect heaven and earth creator wanted to destroy him, the previous incarnation actually understood the mentality of the perfect heaven and earth creator quite well. It was like a body part with all its memories suddenly coming back to life after being cut off. Anyone's first thought about such a body part was obviously to regain control of it. Once it was out of control, one would definitely want to destroy it. Not to mention the perfect heaven and earth creator, even the previous incarnation would definitely make the same choice in such a situation. Because of this, even if the perfect heaven and earth creator wanted to destroy him, he did not feel much hatred towards him. Of course, it was impossible for him to really not care about it at all and still treat him like how he was controlled by the perfect heaven and earth creator in the past. If that was really the case, It would not be open-minded, but cheap. Therefore, the previous incarnation was hostile toward the perfect heaven and earth creator, but he did not have any killing intent. He wanted to teach him a lesson, but he did not really want to completely destroy him. In this way, his attitude at this moment was only natural. The strength to completely destroy me? From inside? The perfect heaven and earth creator was puzzled. Chapter 28:71. If the source of the incarnation's strength came from that world, or if the incarnation had obtained the strength before this, then he would have long left that world and come out to finish him off. How could he have waited until now, when the source of the tribulations had undergone such a drastic change before coming out? Therefore, it was obvious that the strength that the incarnation possessed now that could threaten him should have been obtained recently. Moreover, it was very likely that he had obtained it at this moment, when the source of the tribulations had undergone a drastic change. After all, for existences at their level, the existence of time was actually just an attribute that could be adjusted at will. Since it was an attribute that could be adjusted at will, as long as it didn't appear at the same time, then how big the time difference was completely dependent on the cultivator's thoughts. And obviously, with the attitude that the incarnation had towards the perfect world creator, he would definitely break free as soon as he obtained the strength and resist the perfect world creator. In other words, the time he came out now and the time he obtained the strength must have been extremely short. In this way, was there still a need to say when his strength had increased? If he were to make a bolder guess, his strength increased when the upheaval occurred just now. Then, where was the source of his strength increase? Could it also be caused by the upheaval at the source of the tribulations? The possibility of this was very high. Is there an existence related to the world of laws on it? The perfect world creator asked with a solemn expression. Hearing this, the incarnation smiled and said, "As expected of my former body, you've actually deduced the truth so quickly." So that's the case. The perfect world creator was extremely shocked. At this moment, he vaguely felt that perhaps the status of the creator of the world of laws in this simulated state of chaos was extremely special. In fact, it was even more special than him, the perfect world creator. After all, as the perfect world creator, the many changes that happened to him in the end were actually closely related to him. At this time, you have something more important to do than fighting me, right? Taking a deep breath, the perfect world creator forcefully suppressed the killing intent in his heart towards the incarnation and sneered. Now, he had already seen through the mentality of the incarnation in front of him. At the very least, he could roughly see through it. To him, he was actually not that important, whether it was as an enemy or a hindrance. Under such circumstances, it was unlikely that the former incarnation would take the initiative to make any changes because of him. Whether it was leaving the world he was in or something else, it was the same. Since that was the case, then it was extremely likely that his former incarnation had left the world of laws and appeared in front of him for a reason other than the reason he'd announced earlier. At that moment, the clone smiled. "Looks like you've become smarter." Being praised by his former incarnation in such a tone was definitely not a pleasant feeling for the creator of the perfect world. He sneered. "You seem to be very confident now. Do you think that you have the absolute advantage in terms of strength before me? Isn't that so?" The former incarnation asked calmly. Following this sentence, the creator of the perfect world felt as if some inexplicable danger had suddenly shrouded him. It was as if his body and everything else would instantly collapse and disappear in the next moment. This danger came from the surroundings, the transportation network layer, and even more so from the former incarnation in front of him. At this moment, he clearly knew how big the gap between him and his former incarnation was. Even if it was purely in terms of realm and personal strength, he was still superior to his former incarnation. If all external objects and forces were completely excluded, he would definitely be able to crush the former incarnation in front of him. However, the gap between the amount of resources he possessed and his former incarnation was simply too huge. With such a huge gap in resources, their control over external forces and objects was on a completely different level. With the help of so many external forces and objects, especially in the environment they were in, the strength they could exert was completely reversed. In terms of strength, the perfect world creator of the perfect world was already far inferior to his former incarnation. This gap was even many times greater than the gap between his true strength and the former incarnation's true strength. At this moment, the perfect world creator knew very well that the best thing for him to do was to obediently admit defeat. I didn't expect you to actually grasp such strength in such a short time. With that, he sighed and turned to leave. He was not willing to be obedient and humble, nor was he willing to overestimate himself and fight against this former incarnation. Thus, the only choice he could make was naturally to turn around and leave. Seeing the perfect world creator turn around and leave, the former incarnation did not do anything else. He just watched quietly as the perfect world creator gradually returned to the world he had opened up. Teaching others a lesson and making them suffer was not just attacking the other party and making them suffer physically. In fact, compared to the various experiences and sufferings of the physical body, the mental pressure and mental blow were obviously more fatal. This was also what the former incarnation had done previously. Although he did not do much to the perfect world creator with his physical body and did not teach him too many lessons in this aspect, he had already given the former incarnation enough of a mental blow. Although he did not do much to the perfect world creator with his physical body and did not teach him too many lessons in this aspect, it could be said that the fact that the perfect world creator had chosen to admit defeat meant that he had suffered enough of a blow and learned enough of a lesson. Since that was the case, he naturally would not overdo it and attack the creator of the perfect world in an unnecessary way. After returning to his own world, the perfect world creator had a pained expression on his face. After a long while, he sighed and said, "Looks like I can only watch the upcoming upheaval." As he spoke, he raised his head and looked up at the boundless world, which was also the source of the tribulations. At this moment, the ocean in this part of the world surged endlessly. There seemed to be a colossal creature rolling its body in the depths of the ocean, creating waves that grew larger and larger. This caused the already turbulent ocean to become even more turbulent. Suddenly, a ball of mist streaked across the ocean like a meteor. In the end, it smashed into the ocean like a meteor. From that meteor, the perfect world creator could clearly feel an extremely familiar aura. It was an aura that only belonged to where he was now, the aura of the transportation network layer. How is this possible? Even though he was already mentally prepared for the possibility of a drastic change, the perfect world creator still couldn't accept it and couldn't help exclaiming. That meteor appearing in that region at this moment, what did that mean? It meant that the power of the transportation network layer had already invaded that incomparably great world. What kind of world was that? That was a great world that even the simulated chaos layer was equivalent to an island in it. Just trying to sense if such a world contained the aura of the perfect world that he had once opened up was already almost exhausting his wisdom and energy. However, at this moment, there was actually a simulated chaos layer that forcibly invaded that world with its own power, directly turning into a meteor and smashing into that world. This was simply a slap in the face without any concealment. It's him. At this moment, the figure of his previous incarnation appeared in the perfect world creator's heart. His intuition told him that his previous incarnation must have played a part in this transformation. In fact, it might even be that all of this was caused by his previous incarnation. With this thought in mind, he turned his gaze towards the core of the transportation network layer, where the world was located. With this, his body couldn't help but tremble. With a flash, he left his own world and stood on the road of the transportation network layer. At the same time, there were tens of thousands of world creators that were doing the same thing as him. One by one, the world founders appeared outside their own world and stood upon the path beyond their own world. They all wore different expressions and attitudes as they looked at the target that the world founders were paying attention to. That was where the original world had been. The reason for this was that at this moment, where the world was located, the existence of the world had completely disappeared. What replaced it was a black hole, an incomparably deep and mysterious black hole that seemed to lead to an unimaginable place. From the black hole, all the world creators could feel an unimaginably vast power surging endlessly within it. It seemed that just a trace of that power was enough to completely erase them and everything related to them. This is the passage that leads to that world. At this moment, the perfect world creator already had such a realization. Similar to him, the other world creators also made the same judgment. For a moment, many of the world creators were struggling in their hearts. For the creators of the world, the great world that replaced the tribulation layer, or the source of the tribulations, or whatever the name was incredibly attractive. After all, that world was truly too great, too mysterious, too profound, and too unbelievable. As pioneers of the world, its existence was akin to placing an incomparably perfect work of art in front of them. It was something that they could not create even if they pushed their potential to the limit. For any creator, it was easy to imagine how attractive such an existence was. Therefore, it went without saying how attractive the world was to all the world creators if they had the opportunity to touch it. At this moment, all the world creators had an incomparably strong impulse to charge into that world. However, it was clear that impulses were just impulses at this moment. After all the world creators could clearly see how unfathomable that world was. They could also see the tip of the iceberg as to what the existence that was suspected to be a world of laws experienced after entering that world. The meteor that streaked across the sky had withstood the omnipresent attacks of that world, and even had to endure the endless repulsive force of the ocean after entering it. They placed themselves in the position of the meteor, only to discover that if they entered it alone, what awaited them might not even be the chance to turn into a meteor. In this way, they seemed to have only one way left. That was to join forces with the other world creators. At this moment, the eyes of the world creators began to meet one another. During this process of contact, they all saw what they wanted to see in each other's eyes. The fact that these pioneers were able to grow to this stage and develop their own worlds to this stage meant that their judgment of the situation and their determination when faced with difficult problems were clearly not bad. Very soon, the founders of the world had more or less come to the same conclusion. However, the Great Perfection world creators were not included in the list. It wasn't that the world's founders rejected the perfect world's founders. Even if the perfect world's founders had come into contact with the world of laws before, or even fought with the experts who came out of the world of laws, it was the same. Instead, the perfect world creators hadn't truly made up their minds yet. They hadn't made a final decision yet. Compared to the other world creators, the perfect world creators knew more things and could sense more things from that world. As a result, he naturally had a better understanding of the dangers contained in that world than the other founders of the world. Under such circumstances, they naturally understood that even if they joined forces with the other world creators, the danger was still extremely great. Chapter 2872. The hesitation of the perfect heaven and earth founder didn't make the other heaven and earth founders hesitate. They were not familiar with perfect heaven and earth founders. To them, perfect heaven and earth founders were merely pioneers of a world at the bottom of the transportation network layer. There were tens of millions of such heaven and earth founders in the entire transportation network layer. Under such circumstances, how could they care about the hesitation of a heaven and earth founder? At that moment, the many heaven and earth founders began to leave the perfect heaven and earth founders aside. They began to communicate with each other and discuss how to enter that black hole and that world. Although they planned to enter it, the heaven and earth founders obviously wouldn't be so rash as to rush in without any preparation. A preliminary test was still necessary after all. As a result, more and more space-time spaces and worlds began to appear at the edge of the original location of the world of laws. These space-times and worlds were created by the joint efforts of the heaven and earth founders to deal with the various dangers that might appear in that world. The joint efforts of the many heaven and earth founders gradually attracted the attention of more and more heaven and earth founders. More and more heaven and earth founders who hadn't discovered the abnormality heard about the existence of that world from the other heaven and earth founders, as well as the wonders of the black hole. As heaven and earth founders, how could they be willing to fall behind? Naturally, it was said that most of the world founders had taken the initiative to join the alliance, preparing to probe the other world together with the previous world founders. Soon, almost all the heaven and earth founders in the entire transportation network layer were mobilized. More and more of the power of the creator of the world appeared around the black hole, and the combined power became more and more powerful, more and more terrifying. Once the heaven and earth founders worked together, the potential that was stimulated was beyond imagination. The native life forms that were originally hidden in the many roads of the transportation network layer were discovered by the heaven and earth founders at an unimaginable speed. The reason for this was that they needed the technology of these native life forms to strengthen the essence of the worlds and space-times that they had created around the black hole. The native creatures were constantly discovered and subdued. Most of them even gradually migrated to the vicinity of the black hole and became the residents of the newly opened space-time and worlds. They began to contribute their light and heat to those worlds and space-time, helping those worlds and space-time to grow and expand the power and might contained in those worlds and space-time. Watching all of this from afar, the creator of the perfect world felt even more uneasy. The potential of these world pioneers had been stimulated quite perfectly, and the power that they had erupted with was unimaginably powerful. Looking at them now, it seemed like there was nothing in the universe that could stop them. There was no problem that they could not solve. However, for some reason, he felt that all of this was like scratching an itch through his boots. They seemed extremely powerful, but when it came to their true goal, they seemed to be unable to grasp the main point. Looks like we can't count on them. After having that ominous premonition, the perfect world opener did not go forward to warn the other world openers. Instead, he sentenced them to death. Not to mention that he wasn't interested in sticking a warm face to a cold buttocks. Even if he had such integrity, the other world openers clearly wouldn't have much trust in him. After all, a world opener at the bottom of the hierarchy was criticizing the plans of those who thought that they were at the top, saying that their actions were useless and that their actions were simply scratching an itch through their boots. Who would listen to such words seriously? Even if he was in the shoes of a perfect heaven and earth pioneer, he wouldn't believe it either, let alone those heaven and earth pioneers. While the world openers were preparing, there weren't many changes in that world. Everything was developing according to the previous trajectory. What should be surging was still surging, what should be repelled was still repelled, and what should be counterattacked was still counterattacking. Although it couldn't be called calm, at least there weren't too many changes. It seemed that everything was as planned, and if there was, as for the meteor that appeared at the same time as the world of laws disappeared, or rather, the island, it was still shrouded in fog, still withstanding the rejection of the ocean and being hit again and again by the boundless waves. The waves were unbelievably powerful, although they were far away from each other. The perfect world openers could clearly feel that if the waves hit the world they had created, there would only be one ending for their world: destruction. This kind of attack landed on the island again and again, but it couldn't even disperse the fog on the island. It couldn't even let outsiders see a trace of the inside of the fog. As for the huge island that he found in the beginning, which contained the densest traces of his perfect world, it was even more stable than the island that was suspected to be a world of laws. The fog around the island that was suspected to be a world of laws began to tremble violently under the waves, as if it would collapse in the next moment. As for the island that was suspected to contain traces of his perfect world, it didn't even shake in the face of the boundless waves. Whether it was the fog on the island or the island itself, there wasn't the slightest bit of shaking. It felt even more stable than before. If there was any change in that world that couldn't be ignored, it would be the fog around the island. Faced with such a situation, the perfect world openers couldn't help but feel bewildered. All of this seemed like a storm was brewing, as if some kind of unimaginable change was brewing. In the next moment, there might be a terrifying change that he couldn't understand or even imagine. While he was observing that world, the many world openers in the transportation network layer had already made all the preparations they needed. The many facilities around the black hole had also completely changed at this moment. They looked like layers of protective walls that forcibly suppressed the black hole in the center of the protective walls, sealing any changes that might occur within the protective walls. At this moment, the black hole couldn't even be seen from the outside. One could only see the distorted black hole through those worlds and space-time. After being distorted, the black hole had become hazy, blurry, indistinct, and faintly discernible. Looks like it's about to start. At this moment, the perfect world openers had an epiphany. With so many preparations, the first test of the black hole was obviously about to begin. After all, even in his opinion, the various preparations he had made now were close to the limit. If he wanted to make further preparations, he would need to obtain more information. More information about that black hole, more information about that heaven and earth. In order to obtain more information, he would obviously have to start testing the black hole and that world. Sure enough, as the perfect world openers were thinking about this, black figures began to break through the barriers of space-time and worlds in the facilities and charge towards the black hole. Those black figures looked like tiny dots from afar. However, if one zoomed in, they would discover that they were huge spaceships. That's right, spaceships from a technological civilization. Every spaceship was the size of a planet, and it was densely packed with all kinds of defensive measures, as well as all kinds of strange ecosystems. It could be said that in terms of offensive power, such spaceships weren't even comparable to a treasure refined by any cultivator. However, in terms of the information that could be obtained, a spaceship like this was enough to clearly understand any situation that all living beings might encounter when they stepped into that world. Even the perfect world openers could not help but be in awe of using such spaceships to test the black hole, feeling ashamed of the wisdom of the other world openers. If they're going in the right direction, they might really be able to enter safely with their strength. At this moment, the perfect world openers could not help but have such a thought. In the past, he had always looked down on these world openers and thought that they were dispensable. This was a large part of the reason why he felt that the world openers would not care about his suggestion and could not be bothered to pay attention to them. In fact, he did not even have the intention to give it a try. But now he felt that perhaps he could work a little harder and try to change the way the world openers did things so that they could shift from the wrong path to the right one. Of course, all of this naturally could not start now. At this moment, the world openers had already prepared everything and even started to move. If he went forward, he would have to spend 10 times or even 100 times more effort to change their minds. It would be better to let them suffer a little before he went forward to sell his ideas. Each of those spaceships was different, each with its own characteristics, each with its own emphasis. It could be said that such a large number of spaceships had taken into account almost all the factors that could be considered. The speed of those spaceships could not be considered fast, but it was definitely not slow either. In an unhurried manner, they entered the black hole one after another. At the same time, in the world where the tribulation level was originally located, a dense number of meteors suddenly appeared out of nowhere and began to fall to the ground. Those meteors erupted with incomparably dazzling rays of light in the void, looking just like suns. However, while those meteors appeared quickly, they also disappeared quickly. Very soon, before they even fell to the surface of the sea, those meteors were completely exhausted in the void. All the light eventually extinguished, along with the meteors themselves and the matter that erupted with light. In the end, the only change that was brought to that world was a ray of light that appeared in that world for a while. Apart from that, there was nothing else. All of these changes made the world openers in the transportation network level fall into silence. This was not the result of the test that they wanted. Or rather, this was the result that they feared. They did not receive any feedback from those spaceships. After those spaceships entered that world, they were completely cut off from them. All the spaceships, all the matter, all the ecosystems, and even all the cultivators and powers disappeared without a trace after entering the black hole. Not even a trace of information was sent back before they disappeared. In the end, the information they received and the result of the test was the same as what the creator of the perfect world saw when he raised his head to look at that world. There was not a single bit more, nor was there a single bit less. They were actually wiped out. This thought surged in the minds of the world openers, filling their hearts with indescribable fear. They were afraid of that world and the black hole. It should be noted that the spaceships they had built already contained almost all the characteristics of their world. If there was anything different between those spaceships and their world, it would only be the scale. It could be said that those spaceships would not be able to last long in that world, which also meant that their world and themselves would not be able to last long in that world either. As soon as they thought about how they had planned to enter such a terrifying existence, they could not help but feel a lingering fear. Looks like it's time, the perfect world openers thought to themselves. Chapter 2873. At that moment, a subtle fluctuation suddenly spread out from the black hole. Along with that subtle fluctuation, all the world founders could clearly sense an indescribable power surging out from the black hole. This power was so powerful and terrifying that all the world founders in the transportation network layer felt like they were being enveloped by this irresistible and terrifying power. Apart from that, they could also vaguely sense that the incomparably great world that floated above their heads seemed to have undergone some kind of subtle change. It was as if countless special points had suddenly appeared in their senses. Those dots didn't suddenly glow, change shape, or even make some special movements all of a sudden. If other world founders, those who had not been enveloped by this irresistible and terrifying power, were to look at this part of the world, they would never be able to discover the existence of these peculiar points. To them, this world did not change at all. The entire world looked exactly the same as before. However, at this moment, these points were so obvious in the eyes of the world founders in the transportation network layer that they could not help but shift their gazes from the entire world to those special points. The reason for this was actually very simple. In the eyes of the world founders, those points suddenly had a much stronger sense of existence. This sense of existence was extremely subtle and mysterious. Apart from the world founders themselves, no other existence would feel anything. However, to the world founders, this change in their sense of existence was so obvious and so intense that even if they wanted to ignore it, they could not. Their gazes would involuntarily converge on those special points. What is this? At that moment, similar doubts appeared in the hearts of the world founders. These special points were extremely mysterious, and to them, they were crucial to something. However, all the world founders with some reasoning ability could think of this. However, what exactly were these dots? Why were these dots so special? Why were they so important to them? Everything was a mystery to the creators of this world. At this moment, their gazes involuntarily gathered on the perfect world founder. After all of this was caused by the perfect world founder. Since he was the one who caused all of this, he would definitely know more about all these changes than them. At this moment, in their eyes, the perfect world founder was no longer just a world founder standing at the bottom of the transportation network layer. Instead, it had become a hope, a breakthrough point, a hope that would allow them to understand the secrets of that world, a breakthrough point to solve their current predicament. As for the idea of stopping the perfect world founder, it naturally did not appear in their minds anymore. The perfect world founder let out a long breath at this moment. Although it was more difficult than he had imagined, he had still successfully achieved his goal in the end. What he had done just now was actually very simple. He had used his understanding of that world to try his best to stimulate a certain characteristic of the transportation network layer. Through this characteristic, he had used the black hole as a transit point to produce a subtle resonance with that world. Previously, he had already thought that since that world contained a certain trace of his perfect world, which belonged to that world, it might also contain traces of other worlds. Based on the proportion of his perfect world's traces in that world, this possibility was extremely high. Since that was the case, the transportation network layer and the countless traces of heaven and earth within it could naturally be contained within that heaven and earth. It was just that because that world was too vast, and too great, these traces were too weak and tiny compared to that world. This was why the many world founders in the transportation network layer could not sense the existence of these traces at all. With this thought in mind, he naturally knew which direction he needed to work towards if he wanted to communicate with that world and step into that world. If he wanted to embed external forces and objects into that world, it would be equivalent to going against the original defense system of that world. He would definitely have to withstand a test of that world. This way, unless the external force was strong enough to suppress the defense system of that world and completely ignore the test of that world, it would be impossible to achieve one's goal with this method. Evidently, if one could suppress the defense system of that world and ignore the test of that world, there would naturally be no need to enter that world, much less care about the secrets of that world. Therefore, it could be said that this was a completely wrong direction. It was a completely meaningless direction for the creator of the world. There was no longer a need to walk in this direction when one could walk in this direction. Under such circumstances, there was only one direction that could be chosen, or rather, the only direction that the perfect world founders could think of. That was to use the things that originally existed in that world, the power that existed, and even the traces that existed, to guide foreign things, foreign existences, and foreign powers into that world through resonance. It had always been many times easier to attack from the inside than from the outside. Although it wouldn't be easy for the many world founders to send their powers, or even themselves into that world by going in this direction. But at the very least, compared to the previous direction that was completely meaningless and impossible to take, this direction could still be taken. In that case, was there still a need to say what choice he should make? This was also the choice that the perfect world founders made at this moment. And judging from the current situation, his choice was correct. With this performance, the perfect world founders quickly obtained the recognition of many world founders who originally had a much higher status than him in the transportation network layer. After that, he had only revealed a little of his strength, and this acknowledgement had turned into reverence. The authority to lead an alliance that united all the heavens and earths to step into that world had swiftly fallen into the hands of the perfected heavens and earth's creator. After obtaining this authority, the perfect world founders naturally didn't stand on ceremony and began to make bold and decisive changes to the various preparations that the other world founders had made. Many space-time and worlds around the black hole began to shift and change according to his will. The powers within began to link with one another in a different manner. Even the evolution and development of the living beings in those worlds and within those dimensions began to change according to his will, big or small. In the end, in just a few dozen days, the transportation network layer had undergone earth-shattering changes. It wasn't just those space-times. Those worlds, even the many heavens and earth, had unknowingly established an unimaginably close connection. Many powers, and even some indescribable essence of the world had formed an indescribable exchange in this process. Vaguely, countless indescribable exchanges were being born between the many worlds in the transportation network layer at all times. Even the spiritual network layer, which was originally only in its embryonic form but hadn't truly taken shape, was being integrated in this process and truly taking shape. Of course, the existence of this spiritual network layer was entirely to serve their current plan. Therefore, although the spiritual network layer had already taken shape, it wasn't completely independent. Instead, it existed as an auxiliary simulation of the chaos layer in the transportation network layer. It was like a shadow of the transportation network layer. The one who truly played a leading role in the formation of the spiritual network layer was, of course, the perfect world founders. As the creator of a perfect world, he was not the most powerful and highest existence in this simulated chaos as he had imagined. Instead, he was just one of the inconspicuous existences among the many existences similar to him. However, a perfect world founder was a perfect world founder. No matter what, he was also at the peak of a certain world pyramid. So how could his knowledge be comparable to that of the other world founders in the transportation network layer? To the many pioneers of the world in the transportation network layer, the greatest and most vast existence they had ever seen was perhaps the transportation network layer. Their understanding of the structure of the world pyramid was only starting from the transportation network layer, making an analogy with the transportation network layer and magnifying it to understand it. Under such circumstances, asking them to develop something of theirs to the same level as the transportation network layer was simply as difficult as asking a person to think that they had the ability to grow to the size of the world they were born in. It wasn't absolutely impossible, but normal people obviously wouldn't have such wild thoughts. However, the situation was clearly different for the perfect world founders. The most magnificent existence that the perfect world founders had ever seen was the seven-layered world pyramid structure. Among them, the number of worlds was definitely hundreds of millions of times more than the number of worlds in the transportation network layer. Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't avoid seeing many simulated chaos layers. They naturally had their own understanding of the existence of the simulated chaos layer and naturally had their own understanding of the essence of such an existence. Therefore, they could naturally see the potential of the spiritual network layer at a glance, and they could naturally guide the spiritual network layer to take shape easily. It was also because of the formation of the spiritual network layer that the perfect world founder's position in the alliance could no longer be shaken. It was so much so that in the eyes of many world founders, their position was vaguely comparable to that of Luo Fan. After all, in their eyes, Luo Fan's greatest and most unbelievable achievement was the construction of the transportation network layer that was incomparably vast and had infinite potential. And now, what the perfect world founders had done was to build another simulated chaos layer that was similar to the transportation network layer. Such a method might not make them completely certain that he was above Luo Fan, but they definitely acknowledged that he was already on the same level as Luo Fan. It could be said that compared to other benefits, the establishment of the spiritual network layer was the greatest benefit to the perfect world founders. With this kind of prestige, he would be able to carry out his various plans and truly unite the many worlds. After all, a large number of existences had to cooperate with each other, so it was naturally impossible for everyone to benefit, and not everyone's interests could be guaranteed to the greatest extent. Among them, there would definitely be existences that would obtain more benefits, and there would definitely be existences that would obtain less benefits, and there might even be losses. Under such circumstances, if the existence who created the plan did not have enough strength and prestige, how could he successfully carry out his plan? And it was obvious that the perfect world founder's actions of establishing the spiritual network layer had given them enough prestige and strength to guide the establishment of the spiritual network layer. Naturally, it was impossible for them to have no authority in the spiritual network layer. And with authority, they could naturally borrow a portion of the spiritual network layer's power, which was strength. We can begin the first test. Everyone, don't worry. The flow of time here is not synchronized with the flow of time in that world. Although I don't know how much time has passed in that world, I do know that the flow of time in that world is definitely not as long as the flow of time we have experienced. On this day, the perfect world founder stood in front of the black hole and said to the many world founders who had come to his side with their clones. Hearing this, the expressions of the world founders eased up slightly. Chapter 2874. Just as the heaven and earth founders in the transportation network layer were about to take action under the unification of the perfect heaven and earth founders, a rather intense change suddenly occurred in that part of the world. In just an instant, countless meteors appeared out of nowhere in that part of the world and fell towards the ocean of that part of the world. The other heaven and earth founders only felt a certain powerful and firm essence from those meteors. However, the perfect world creator sensed even more than that. He sensed far, far too many auras that he was extremely familiar with from within. Those were the auras of the worlds that were previously shackled by his perfect heaven and earth. Evidently, Even if those meteors weren't the original bodies of those worlds, they were definitely things that had an extremely close connection with those worlds. It might even be something similar to the probing preparations that the previous heaven and earth founders had made. Looks like they're doing the same thing. This thought flashed through the perfect heaven and earth founder's mind. Those meteors didn't appear for too long in that part of the world. They didn't even have time to land on the ocean before they disappeared without a trace under the effects of the various mechanisms of that world, as if they had never appeared. At this moment, the many heaven and earth founders in the transportation network layer couldn't help but empathize with them. Evidently, that was what the other heaven and earth founders had chosen them to do. Along with this feeling of empathy, they began to acknowledge the creator of the perfect world a little more. It must be said that if it wasn't for the perfect heaven and earth founder, they would still be working hard in the wrong direction. Just as the many heaven and earth founders had complicated feelings, more changes appeared in that part of the world one after another. Meteors fell from the sky, islands emerged from the depths of the ocean, and illusory figures appeared out of nowhere on the surface of the ocean. There were also shadows that suddenly appeared in a certain region and quickly spread out towards that part of the world. In the beginning, the heaven and earth founders didn't feel much. They just felt that the simulated chaotic state of the world was coincidentally taking action against that part of the world at this moment. But very soon, the heaven and earth founders fell silent. It wasn't just the other heaven and earth founders. Even the perfect heaven and earth founder fell silent at this moment. The reason for this was very simple. It was because there were simply too many disturbances. If a movement referred to a world and a heaven and earth founder, then ever since the appearance of those meteors, the number of heaven and earth founders that had movements in less than 3 days had exceeded trillions of trillions of trillions. Not only did this number exceed the understanding of the numerous world founders in the transportation network layer regarding the number of worlds simulated in the state of chaos, but it also exceeded the understanding of the perfect world founders regarding the number of worlds. There are actually so many heaven and earth in this chaos. At this moment, even the perfect heaven and earth founder couldn't help but have such a thought. Just the number of worlds that had moved in the past few days, or rather, the number of worlds represented by those movements had already far exceeded the number of worlds contained in the world pyramid structure that he originally stood at the peak of. And this also proved his previous guess that the structure of the heaven and earth pyramid that he had previously controlled might just be one of the many structures of the heaven and earth pyramid in the state of chaos. In other words, the perfect heaven and earth that he had previously established might only be one of the countless perfect heaven and earth that existed in the chaos state. Before this, it was just a guess. But now, the amount of activity that appeared in that world had already proved his guess to be correct. At the very least, it proved that the world pyramid structure that he had previously understood, which was all the heaven and earth in the chaos state, was not the only complete world pyramid structure in the chaos state. The complete world pyramid structure naturally referred to the world pyramid structure that had 7 layers, with the highest layer being the perfect heaven and earth. Because of this sudden change, the many heaven and earth founders in the transportation network layer had stopped their original plans and gathered around the black hole. They looked up at the heaven and earth that seemed to be floating above their heads, yet was infinitely far away from them. There seemed to be an extremely special mechanism in that heaven and earth, causing the originally scattered probing actions to erupt together. After all, no matter how coincidental it was, the countless heaven and earth founders that were scattered in the chaos state could not have probed that heaven and earth at the same time, or more specifically, in the past 3 days. Right now, they were acting as if they were probing at the same time, which was clearly the result of that heaven and earth. Based on the time relationship between the many heaven and earth layers in the chaos state, the heaven and earth that had probed that heaven and earth in the past 3 days might have studied that heaven and earth for hundreds of millions of years, or even hundreds of trillions of years. Or perhaps they had only probed that heaven and earth the moment it appeared, which was not impossible. The difference in time was obviously nothing to that heaven and earth, or rather, it was nothing to the special mechanism that existed in that heaven and earth. Due to some special reason, that heaven and earth had combined all the probing and compressed it into those 3 days. But why isn't it the same for us? The heaven and earth founders in the transportation network layer were not people who did not know how to think. Very soon, some of the heaven and earth founders thought of this point, and all of them could not help but turn their eyes to the black hole. The appearance of the black hole was rather strange, and it only appeared because of the disappearance of the heaven and earth. Originally, they did not think that the appearance of the black hole was anything to be surprised about. However, now that they thought about it, the appearance of the black hole was clearly a little special. At the very least, it was not something that would appear in other chaos state simulations. This judgment was actually very easy to make. After all, in the chaos state simulation, it was impossible for all the heaven and earth in the chaos state simulation to take the initiative to enter that heaven and earth, and then open the passage to that heaven and earth. Even if the number of heaven and earth that had appeared in that heaven and earth in the past 3 days was not all the heaven and earth in the chaos state simulation, it definitely accounted for a considerable proportion of all the heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, the situation of these heaven and earth could naturally be seen as all the heaven and earth in the chaos state simulation, or rather, all the situation in the chaos state simulation. Perhaps before this, the many heaven and earth founders in the transportation network layer would have thought that the black hole was the prerequisite for probing that heaven and earth. However, after seeing so many heaven and earth probing that heaven and earth, they clearly knew that this was not the case. The many heaven and earth founders might have some special characteristics, but it was obvious that not all of them could be like the heaven and earth founders in the transportation network layer, who could have a black hole that led to that heaven and earth. Following this chain of reasoning, they were very quickly able to attribute the difference between them and the other heaven and earth founders to the existence of the black hole. For a moment, the hearts of the many heaven and earth founders were a little excited. Although they still did not know the specific use of this difference, they were all extremely clear that this was definitely their advantage. Our time has already unified with that heaven and earth through this passage. In the end, it was the perfect heaven and earth founder who made the conclusion that many heaven and earth founders were looking forward to but could not understand. This black hole was a passage that led directly to that heaven and earth. Through this black hole, matter could be communicated, power could be communicated, and laws could be communicated. In that case, it was obvious that time and space could also be communicated. Clearly, given the size of that heaven and earth and the incomparably great essence of that heaven and earth, the transportation network layer was most likely to be assimilated during this communication. Therefore, the flow of time in the transportation network layer would naturally be assimilated by the flow of time in that heaven and earth. Hearing this judgment, many heaven and earth founders came to a sudden realization. Indeed, if this was the explanation, then everything would make sense. Because the flow of time in the transportation network layer was already the same as that heaven and earth, if the other heaven and earth's probing of that heaven and earth were compressed in a bursting out at the same time in a short period of time, then those probing would naturally be compressed into bursting out at the same time in a short period of time. In contrast, because the time of their probing was the same as that heaven and earth, their probing of that heaven and earth would naturally follow their own sequence and their own time. Let's begin. They won't succeed. At this moment, the perfect heaven and earth founder interrupted the thoughts of many other heaven and earth founders. At this moment, many heaven and earth founders were pondering the meaning of everything they had seen, while others focused their attention on the results of the various probing that appeared in that heaven and earth. The other heaven and earth founders had chosen all sorts of strange probing methods that had almost exhausted their imaginations. Even probing methods that resonated with a certain existence in that heaven and earth had appeared. Under such circumstances, how could they miss the results of the other heaven and earth founders' probing? After all, they could learn a lot from the results of their probing. This way, they could avoid repeating the probing themselves. This would prevent them from wasting time and energy in the process. Why? Some heaven and earth founders couldn't understand the perfect heaven and earth founders' arbitrary judgment, so they immediately asked. The other heaven and earth founders also turned to look at the perfect heaven and earth founder thoughtfully. They also really wanted to know the answer to this question. That's because their situation is completely different from ours. They won't be able to do what we can do. They won't be able to do what we can succeed. The perfect heaven and earth founder said faintly. If the perfect heaven and earth founder had just met the other heaven and earth founders, he would definitely be scolded like dog sh*t for his answer. However, it was clear that this wasn't the first time the perfect heaven and earth founder had met the other heaven and earth founders. During this period of time, the perfect heaven and earth founder had deeply engraved his authority in the hearts of the other heaven and earth founders. Therefore, even though most of the heaven and earth founders felt that the perfect heaven and earth founder was being a little too arbitrary, they weren't completely sure that the perfect heaven and earth founder was just talking nonsense. Even in the face of such baseless judgments, they still held a dubious attitude in their hearts. Although they were dubious, it was enough for them to support the perfect heaven and earth founder with all their might. After all, no matter what, this was just a test. Even if the test failed, it would only make them waste some energy, but it wouldn't cause them any harm. Since that was the case, being dubious was enough for them to do it. The perfect heaven and earth founder clearly knew the mentality of the other heaven and earth founders. After saying that, he didn't say anything else and directly started to implement the plan that the other heaven and earth founders had made in the beginning. He started to use the nature of the transportation network to try his best to resonate with the points that existed in the heaven and earth that were extremely important in the eyes of the other heaven and earth founders at this time. Those points that were extremely important in the eyes of the other heaven and earth founders were none other than the traces of the transportation network that existed in that heaven and earth. The transportation network was formed by the combination of numerous heaven and earth founders. Under such circumstances, the traces of the transportation network were naturally equivalent to the gathering of the traces of many heaven and earth founders. Chapter 2875. Under the cooperation of many founders, the many worlds and space-time around the black hole at the core of the transportation network layer began to undergo indescribable changes according to the original plan. As the changes occurred, an invisible power slowly seeped into the black hole. At the same time, the existence of the many dots in the world that had just appeared in the eyes of the founders grew stronger. It was even to the extent that the founders of the world had a vague feeling that everything around those dots had disappeared. It was as if only those dots that they were paying attention to were left in that world. At this moment, more and more worlds in the transportation network layer were mobilized. All sorts of powers were transmitted. And in the end, under the control of the founders, they seeped into the black hole in an extremely mysterious way, gradually triggering all sorts of subtle changes in that world. In the end, the entire transportation network layer was mobilized. Although it wasn't to say that all the power had been invested in this task, at the very least, all the participating worlds and founders had participated in it. But at the very least, all the participating heavens and earths, the creators of the heavens and earths, had participated in it. A portion of their strength, a portion of their power, and a portion of their essence had joined the plan. It could be said that aside from the scale, everything that had been invested in the plan had reached everything that could be found in the transportation network layer. At that moment, the many founders of the world suddenly felt a strange connection, as if they had suddenly established a connection with something in that world. The connection was so subtle that they could even manipulate that existence to produce all sorts of changes. They could even vaguely receive some senses from that existence. It was a boundless ocean. In the depths of the ocean, there were some sparsely scattered black dots. Those black dots seemed to be the source of the turmoil, the abnormality of the entire ocean. The closer they got to those black dots, the more turbulent the ocean became, and waves soared into the sky and wreaked havoc everywhere. Of course, most of them were still charging towards those black dots. The heaven and earth founders wanted to see more, but they discovered that their senses could only see so much. Although the connection wasn't severed, it was still the same as before. They could still sense that existence and sense that world through that existence. However, it could not support their endless strengthening of this sense. It could not support their true senses and vision to be completely unleashed in that part of the world, on that existence that had established a connection with them. If it was their true bodies, no matter how many billions of light years it was, as long as they wanted to see, all the details, at least on the surface, would appear in their eyes. No matter what, the people here were the ones who could split the heavens and earth apart. As the creators of the world, they were not existences that ordinary cultivators could compare to. They all possessed powers that ordinary cultivators could only dream of. Drawing something that was infinitely far away to their side and imprinting all of its details into their eyes was just a kind of instinct for them. It's because we didn't invest enough. At that moment, many of the founders of the world came to a conclusion about the restrictions they were facing. At the end of the day, they were only probing that part of the world and had only invested a portion of their power into the plan. The advantage of doing that was that even if the plan failed and everything they invested was lost due to the effects of that world, it would not affect them much. However, there was also a disadvantage to doing that. Even if the plan succeeded, they would only achieve part of their goal. Just like at this moment, they could sense the existence that resonated with them, and they could even slightly control the existence in that location. However, their senses were limited, and the control they had over that existence was extremely powerless. He clearly felt that as long as he exerted a little more force, he would be able to control that existence and make that existence truly move and come to life. However, he lacked that little bit of force. No matter how hard he tried and how much force he exerted, that existence remained unmoved. There was no change at all. Let's really begin. The wills of the many founders finally gathered at the location of the perfect world creator, allowing him to instantly make a decision. Many of the founders instantly heaved a sigh of relief. An indescribable sense of anticipation surged in their hearts, making them feel inexplicably excited. At that moment, their respect for the perfect world creator had almost reached the limit. At the very least, the things that they doubted due to his authority had been proven to be correct. Since that was the case, then what about the things that he hadn't revealed? Or how many of the things that he said that they wouldn't believe were correct? At this moment, they couldn't help but have an almost endless expectation for the creator of the perfect world, facing such expectations and reverence. The perfect world creator did not show any change on his face, but he felt an indescribable pressure in his heart. Even though he was used to being at the peak of the pyramid structure, he still couldn't maintain his composure in the face of so many perfect world creators' desires and expectations. However, he was still a perfect world creator after all. Even in the face of such pressure, he could still quickly adjust himself and erase the pressure from the bottom of his heart, allowing himself to completely calm down. He immediately began to pour his will into the world of the many founders. If it was before, his actions would have been stopped no matter what, or at the very least, he would have been instinctively resisted by the founders. However, at this moment, his authority had become unprecedentedly heavy, and everything that had happened before had proven that he was right. The situation was completely different. Currently, although the founders weren't completely indifferent to the will of the perfect world creators pouring into their world, they had taken the initiative to suppress their instincts because of their trust in the perfect world creators. They allowed the will to fuse into their world and gradually began to take control of the power, and even the essence of their world. If this will was contaminated and turned into a kind of light, then at this moment the entire transportation network layer, starting from the black hole, would be continuously lit up. There were all sorts of founders, and naturally, they had all sorts of thoughts. Although almost all the founders had joined the plan and planned to follow the perfect world creators, to explore that world and try to understand the various mysteries of that world, there was still a portion of the founders who weren't interested in it. But in the end, there was still a portion of the world's founders that were not interested in it. Even though they seemed to be benefiting from it, they did not join the plan. For such founders, There was no reason for the perfect world creators to contaminate their world with their will. Therefore, he could only let go of those worlds. In the end, there were many black spots in the transportation network layer that were lit up. At the very least, they looked like black spots. These black dots were extremely eye-catching and awkward in the eyes of the cultivators who had just opened up the world. If they had time, the world creators would have used all sorts of methods to force the other world creators to join the plan. However, it was clear that they could only endure the awkwardness in their hearts at this moment. Under the wills of the perfect heaven and earth creators, the many worlds began to change. Terrifying might, power, and even the essence of the world began to emerge from the many worlds, gathering towards the black hole at the center of the transportation network layer, along with the wills of the perfect heaven and earth creators. In the end, it fused into the black hole and was transmitted to that world through the black hole. In an incredibly subtle and mysterious way, it fused with the points of existence that the perfect heaven and earth creators saw, causing those points to resonate more and more strongly with the perfect heaven and earth creators. In this resonance, the world creators felt that their perception of that existence was getting stronger and stronger. With the help of that existence, the things they could see, sense, and even control over that existence were increasing almost endlessly. At this moment, facing such changes, the hearts of the world creators were filled with surprise and anticipation. This situation meant that the outcome that they wanted the most had started to appear before them. At this moment, the world creators shifted their attention to the countless black spots that they could see with the help of the existence that had formed a connection with them. In other words, the islands. The focus of their attention was on the largest black dot, or rather, the island, which was the true source of the turbulence in the world's oceans. But at this moment, they suddenly felt that something was amiss. It was as if the largest island was getting bigger and bigger in their eyes. The waves, repulsive forces, and impacts in the surroundings were also becoming more and more obvious and intense. It was as if their perception had suddenly grown out of their control. It was also as if they were charging towards the island at an unbelievable speed. Facing this situation, the world creators were stunned. But very quickly, they recovered from their shock and started to carefully examine the existence that was closely connected to them. All of a sudden, they discovered that it was actually the second situation. It wasn't that their perception had grown out of their control, but that they were really charging towards the largest island. No, that's a place of trouble. It's still too early for us to enter that place. At this moment, the world creators cried out in their hearts, and their expressions became extremely nervous. They tried their best to stop that existence and make it stop somewhere on the surface of the ocean. But it was a pity that no matter how hard they tried, that existence kept moving towards its target without the slightest pause. It didn't care about their thoughts at all. An uncontrollable emotion surged from the bottom of their hearts. The world creators weren't fools, so they quickly thought of a possible reason. Their main bodies in the transportation network layer turned their gazes to the perfect world creator beside the black hole. To be able to do all this, to directly take over their control of the world, and to cut off their control of the existence in that part of the world that resonated with them, no matter how they thought about it. Only the creator of the perfect world could do it. At this moment, when they looked at the black hole, they suddenly realized that the creator of the perfect world had disappeared. Along with the disappearance of the perfect heaven and earth creator, the perfect heaven and earth creator, which was at the bottom of the transportation network layer, also disappeared along with the disappearance of the perfect heaven and earth creator. At this moment, the original location of the world that the perfect world creator had opened up was already empty. There, the path was cut off. It was as if there had been a world there, but this world was suddenly snatched away by some unimaginably terrifying power. It was as if the path that connected this world to this world was instantly severed. Damn it, we've been tricked. At this moment, one of the world creators let out a deafening roar. His words caused those who had been guessing whether there was a problem with the perfect world opener to instantly tremble, and they all came to a sudden realization. Wasn't this situation the perfect world creator had used all of them and used all of their power, and essence to get rid of them and achieve his goal? He actually used us, said one creator after another, gnashing his teeth in anger. We must stop the loss of power and essence. Otherwise, we won't be able to find time. The words of a world creator spread throughout the transportation network layer. Chapter 2876. Hearing the words of the founder of this world, the other founders were instantly horrified. In the blink of an eye, they tossed everything else aside and began to do their best to control their power and essence, trying their best to slow down the loss of their power and essence. It was an extremely difficult process, even for the pioneers of the world. At this moment, the effects of their respective efforts were rather average. Although it was slightly useful and not completely useless, it was ultimately only slightly useful. At the very most, it would only slow down the rate at which his strength and essence flowed away completely, but it was impossible to truly stop it from flowing away in the end. At this point, the world founders became even more nervous. They didn't even have the time to think about where the complete world founder was. After all, compared to everything related to the complete world, their lives were more important. Seeing that they could not stop their own power and essence from flowing away, the many founders of heaven and earth instinctively moved closer to each other, instinctively linking their own power and essence together, relying on each other's power to further stop the flow of power and essence. Clearly, working together wasn't useless. As they joined together, it was like they were weaving a net. The creators of the world began to connect with each other, pulling each other in. Their powers were linked together, complementing each other, and in the end, it slowed down the speed of the flow of time. If the original loss of power and essence was 100, then after they added their power to each other, the loss of power and essence was roughly 90. But at this moment, after they worked together and supported each other, the loss of power and essence had become less than 1. The speed at which it was slowing down was already quite impressive. At this moment, the founders of the heavens and earth heaved a sigh of relief in their hearts. It had been reduced to 1%, which meant that they had 100 times more time than before. This 100 times more time was clearly more than enough for them to have a greater chance of survival. It was also enough for them to have a greater chance of escaping from their current predicament. Now, they finally had the chance to find out where the creator of the perfect world was and how he achieved his goal previously. They didn't have the time to consider this before because the loss of their power and essence was more important. But it wasn't because they weren't important. In fact, the importance of these things was beyond imagination. After all, where was the creator of perfect worlds and realms now? What exactly did he do before? The various details that they did not discover, and so on and so forth, were all related to how their power and essence were lost. Right now, they were slowing down the flow of their power and essence by relying on their own control and suppression of the world around them. It was just like when a person was being pulled by a rope, they were resisting with all their might and exerting all their strength in the opposite direction. They were only using brute force to stop the flow of their power and essence. If one had enough strength, this method would naturally be enough to free oneself from the fate of being pulled and dragged. However, it was clear that if one's own strength was insufficient, this method would only be able to slow down the speed at which one was dragged at this moment. Many of the world founders were in a situation where they didn't have enough power. It was the same person. When he was being pulled, he could resist with brute force. However, he could also use another method to change his fate. That was to cut the rope. As long as the rope was cut, the pulling force would not be able to affect his body, and he would naturally not be dragged. At this moment, to many of the world founders, the rope was hidden in the entire plan of the creator of perfect worlds and was hidden in everything related to the creator of perfect worlds and realms at this moment. Therefore, if they want to cut the rope, the only thing they could do was to study the various aspects of the creator of perfect worlds and realms. This method of cutting the rope could be used at any time. In fact, it could even be said that the earlier they used it, the smaller the losses. Under such circumstances, the best time for the founders to use this method was clearly at the beginning, when they had yet to join forces. After all, that was the earliest time they discovered that they were being pulled. However, the pulling force at that time was simply too great. It was so great that if they were slightly delayed, the final outcome would be something they could not bear. Under such circumstances, they could only use brute force to stop the speed at which they were being pulled. At this moment, an indescribable existence appeared out of thin air in that part of the world, on the island that was the source of the greatest turmoil in the world's oceans. From the outside, this island seemed to be shrouded in mist. However, from the inside, it was completely different from the outside world. From the outside, there was no difference between this place and the outside world. Outside the island was the never-ending waves, the boundless ocean. Indeed, this is my world. At this moment, a voice came from the indescribable existence that had descended on this island. This indescribable existence was none other than the combination of the creator of perfect worlds and the world he had created after losing his perfect worlds. That's right, it was not a clear distinction between the world founder and the world. Instead, it was a combination of the world founder and the world. This combination possessed the nature of living beings and the nature of the world. As the combination of the two, it was extremely mysterious and wonderful. In this world, it endured some kind of indescribable pressure, but at the same time, it also received all kinds of indescribable blessings. In particular, on this island, it could constantly sense the indescribable existences that were constantly being born from the surrounding islands and pouring into its body. This fusion of the world and the world founder did not appear out of thin air, nor was it formed by the will of the creator of perfect worlds. Instead, it was the result of the combined efforts of the many founders of this world and the transportation network layer. The perfect heaven and earth pioneer had indeed schemed against the numerous heaven and earth pioneers in the transportation network layer from the very beginning. However, his plan was not to completely absorb the power and essence of the world founders to fulfill himself. Instead, he just wanted to use the resonance between the world founders and the world to gather that resonance on his body. In the end, he could sense this world more deeply and even borrow the power of this world to safely enter this world. However, things were indeed under his control at the beginning. From the moment he gathered the resonance between the world founders and the world on his body, everything seemed extremely normal. It was only when the resonance was truly produced that the situation became strange. When his resonance with this world reached a certain level, and his perception of this world also reached an unimaginable limit, he suddenly felt that there was some kind of unimaginable suction coming from this world, and it began to madly absorb him. This kind of absorption targeted his essence, targeted his power. With this absorption force, even if he had the support of the world, he would not be able to last more than a few breaths. Under such circumstances, as the creator of perfect worlds who had a strong desire to survive, there was no need to explain what he would do. Naturally, he would transfer the absorption and let the many world founders in the transportation network layer bear the absorption for him. Relying on this process, he tried his best to communicate with the traces that his perfect worlds had left in that world. He wanted to regain control of those traces and use them to completely descend to that world. Once he regained control of those traces and completely descended to that world, the absorption would no longer work. Otherwise, even if he transferred the absorption effect and let the many world founders in the transportation network layer bear the absorption for him, it would not be a long-term solution. After all, the power and essence of the world founders in the transportation network layer were not limitless. At the very least, they were not limitless in essence. Under such circumstances, no matter how many of them there was a limit to how long they could withstand the absorption. If this continued, they might be able to hold on for a long time, but there would be a day when they would not be able to withstand the absorption and disappear completely. If he could not cut off the absorption before the world founders in the transportation network layer disappeared, then he would be sucked dry by that world once again. It was precisely because of this that the creator of the perfect world would so decisively seek to descend to this world during this process. The final outcome was even more perfect than he had imagined. One must know that he originally thought that it was a trace that his perfect worlds had left in that world. Although the trace was deep, it was still a trace. It would be extremely difficult for him to control the trace. Perhaps it would be of help to him and reduce the difficulty of him descending to that world. But in the end, there was still a limit to it. In the end, it would be extremely difficult for him to truly descend to that world. However, he did not expect that when he really wanted to descend to that world, the trace would produce an unimaginable pulling force. The pulling force was so powerful that it was as if a powerhouse that was millions of times more powerful than the perfect world's creators had grabbed him and pulled him in that direction, making the perfect world's creators feel that it was impossible to resist. Moreover, the pulling force was not only directed at him, but also everything related to him, including the world that he had opened up later on. Under such a pulling force, he could not resist at all, and had already crashed into that world along with that world. He turned into that condensation and appeared on that island. In that instant, he discovered that the consumption of his power and essence had stopped. However, he still did not stop absorbing the power and essence of the world founders in the transportation network layer. In fact, compared to before, it had become even stronger and even more unstoppable. It was just that his previous absorption of the power and essence was used to replace his consumption and to replace his absorption by this world. But now, he was absorbing the power and essence of the world to strengthen himself and enhance himself. Faintly, he could sense that his absorption wasn't limitless. At a certain moment, this absorption would stop. And that moment would be when the distance between the corresponding existences of the world founders and this island was reduced to zero. Once the connection between the corresponding existences and this island was reduced to zero, it would mean that they had entered the range of this island. At that time, he did not know what changes would happen. However, they knew that such a change would definitely change the predicament they were in right now. The predicament of being absorbed, of course. This also meant that he would lose the opportunity to improve, and he would not be able to be like he was now, where his power and essence would be endlessly enhanced and sublimated. I hope they can last until they enter this island. At this moment, this thought flashed through the mind of the perfect world's creators. However, that was only a thought. To him, what was more important was no longer the world founders, but the essence of this island in front of him, as well as why this island was so different from when it was still a perfect world. That's right. Although he could clearly sense that this island originated from his perfect world back then, he could also clearly sense that this island was vastly different from the perfect world back then. This difference was not the kind of difference after the perfect world turned into an island. Chapter 2877. This distortion is a little familiar. Such a thought flashed across the perfect world's creator's mind. In the eyes of the perfect world's creator, the traces on this island that belonged to the perfect world seemed to have undergone some kind of distortion that he was quite familiar with. This distortion was so obscure, yet so deep. Under this distortion, he even felt as if he had arrived in a world that he was originally quite familiar with, the world of law. Suddenly, he came back to his senses and realized what this distortion was all about. This was clearly the distortion of the perfect world's traces into the traces of the world of law. Looking at the terrain of this island, looking at the laws and laws within it, looking at the great Tao in the dark, looking at the humanoid creatures that were born from it, looking at the indescribable aura that surged in the void, wasn't everything the appearance of the world of law? How is this possible? Could it be the means of that incarnation? How is this possible? Even I can't do this. So how could he have done it? The perfect world's creator was incomparably shocked, and he felt as if his worldview had been overturned. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, and he began to search for the traces of his former incarnation. Previously, the world of law and the transportation network layer had clearly already entered this world, and the black hole channel that didn't exist in the other layers that simulated the chaotic state had clearly appeared because of this. Previously, the perfect world's creator still didn't know where the world of law had gone. Whether it had turned into an ordinary island on the sea of this world, or become a more special existence in this world, or simply been completely destroyed by this world. The perfect world's creator didn't know all these things. However, at this moment, he discovered that the world might have already been thrown into the island and had fused with it. In fact, the distortion caused by this island might also be due to the fusion of the world of law. Although he wasn't sure why this distortion appeared, and why the former incarnation didn't fuse with his world like he was doing now, turning into a special state between a living being and the world. However, there were simply too many secrets in this world. Who knew what inconceivably special things were hidden within it? Perhaps there was some mechanism that he hadn't discovered that caused this result. However, if that was really the case, then the previous incarnation would definitely appear on this island. Although his previous incarnation had completely severed its connection with him, and even the traces of him had been completely cut off, it was still his incarnation. No matter how it changed, it was impossible to completely erase this point. Since it was once his incarnation, he would naturally have a subtle sense of it. It was impossible for it to be erased. Under such circumstances, it was naturally easier for him to find the existence of his former incarnation on this island than to find other existences. At this moment, his heart stirred slightly, and he spread out his senses. He began to spread out towards this seemingly island, but in reality, it was a world of its own. He continuously followed that subtle feeling to search for the existence of his previous incarnation. After an unknown period of time, his heart trembled slightly, and he suddenly felt an indescribable suppressive force. This suppressive force froze time, space, rules, laws, dimensions, and even possibilities, the great Tao, and everything else. The moment his senses probed into the suppressive force, he was also suppressed by it and instantly became sluggish. This sluggishness was like a plague that instantly spread out from the suppressive force. In the blink of an eye, it had already spread to his body, instantly causing him to fall into a sluggish state. In that instant, he looked like he had instantly turned into a statue. It was even to the extent that it seemed to have become a natural phenomenon between the heavens and the earth. It was a stagnant and eternal natural phenomenon that had existed since ancient times. You actually used this method to enter. At this moment, a voice suddenly appeared out of nowhere in the void. Then, a figure gradually walked out of the void. This figure was none other than the previous incarnation of the perfect heaven and earth creator. Compared to the original incarnation, this previous incarnation seemed to have undergone some indescribable changes. Its essence seemed to have improved slightly, and in terms of level, it had actually surpassed the perfect heaven and earth creator. You finally appeared. At this moment, the perfect heaven and earth creator suddenly spoke. He was still in that sluggish state, and it seemed like he was still being suppressed. However, his thoughts could still operate, and he could still communicate with the outside world. You actually still have thoughts? The previous incarnation was slightly stunned. At this moment, he suddenly had an inexplicable feeling, as if he had somewhat underestimated his previous body. All of this, what exactly is going on? Why? Why has my world been distorted like this? Why are you here? What exactly do you want to achieve? A large number of questions instantly surged towards the previous incarnation. What does this mean to you? The previous incarnation asked curiously. His words were filled with incomprehension. Don't you know how bad your situation is now? You don't even have the ability to move a finger, let alone mobilize any power. It can be said that you no longer have the ability to resist. If I wanted to, I could poke you with a finger and you would die. Under such circumstances, what's the point of asking these things? The previous incarnation said faintly at this moment. It seems like you still don't know me well enough. The perfect heaven and earth creator said faintly. Knowing is the point. For the current me, apart from knowing new things, what else is worth pursuing? Hearing this, the previous incarnation looked at the perfect heaven and earth creator with a strange gaze. He could naturally guess what the perfect heaven and earth creator was thinking. After all, for the perfect heaven and earth creator, he had stood at the peak of the simulated chaos for countless trillions of years. The perfect heaven and earth creator had a venerable status, and his realm had been raised to the limit that the simulated chaos could bear. In fact, everything he saw and heard had already reached the peak of simulating the state of chaos. Under such circumstances, for him, there was no longer anything substantial to pursue in this simulated chaos. If he had to pursue something and set a goal, after thinking about it, it seemed that the only thing he could pursue was to see more new things and figure out those secrets that he didn't know before. It was precisely because of this that he gave such an answer just now. If it was in the past, before he had seen the world of laws and entered this world and this island, the previous incarnation would still feel that the perfect heaven and earth creator's thoughts were correct and that this pursuit was the only thing he could pursue. However, it was no longer the past. After seeing the world of laws, this world, this island, Luo, Fan, and the three-legged cauldron, he understood that even in this simulated chaos, he was still an insignificant existence. He thought that he had a close understanding of the simulated chaos, but in fact, he was just a frog at the bottom of a well. Because he had always seen the sky that was the size of the mouth of the well, he thought that the entire sky was only the size of the mouth of the well. The limit of the sky was the size of the mouth of the well. The real sky was billions and trillions of times larger than he had imagined it to be. The real world was billions of times more complicated and profound than what he had observed. There was nothing left to pursue. This was simply a joke. In front of them, there was still an infinite path waiting for them to walk. At this moment, the previous incarnation finally felt that he had surpassed his former main body. Is that so? It's a pity that I can't reveal the truth to you. Otherwise, you'll know how laughable your words are. The previous incarnation sighed and looked at the creator of the perfect world with pity. Hearing this, the perfect heaven and earth creator frowned. He was very familiar with this attitude. It was usually the attitude he had towards those who couldn't see the truth of the world, space-time, or the truth of the world. Was I wrong? At this moment, he couldn't help but have such a thought. However, he quickly tossed this thought aside. Although the world in front of him and the island had many secrets, these secrets were not of much use to him. Even if he knew everything and figured everything out, his realm would only stop at this level. His future path had been completely cut off. He had already walked to his own limit, reached his own peak. No matter what he knew or figured out, it would only increase his knowledge and satisfy his curiosity. He wasn't wrong. At that moment, he calmed down and said, "Perhaps. In that case, what's the reason for all this?" When the previous incarnation heard this, he knew that the perfect heaven and earth creator didn't take his words to heart. However, he didn't care either. Obviously, he wasn't saying this to make the perfect heaven and earth creator come to his senses and be grateful to him. He was saying this because he had some enlightenment in his heart. It could be said that he was just saying it for himself to hear. In this case, what meaning did the feedback from the perfect heaven and earth creator mean to him? I'm not interested in saying it. Go figure out what you want to know. I think it shouldn't be a difficult task for you. The former incarnation smiled faintly. As he spoke, his figure turned blurry and disappeared without a trace in a short while, as if he had never been there. When the perfect heaven and earth creator saw that the previous incarnation didn't solve any of his problems, he was naturally extremely displeased. However, he clearly didn't have the ability to make the previous incarnation stay, let alone force the other party to answer his questions honestly. For the current him, being able to transmit his thoughts and listen to the thoughts of the outside world was already because of his special form of existence. In this state, he couldn't even use any of his abilities, so how could he do anything? At this moment, he could only watch as the previous incarnation disappeared without a trace. You can even comprehend these secrets? As the previous incarnation disappeared, the last words left by the previous incarnation began to reverberate in his heart. At this moment, after the previous incarnation left, he entered an indescribable place. This place surpassed the island, or rather, surpassed the island that the perfect heaven and earth creator had seen. Here, he could see the island that the perfect heaven and earth creator had seen when he lowered his head. In other words, he could see the entire view of the world that looked like the world of laws. When he looked up, he could see a three-legged cauldron emitting endless suppressive power that spread out and covered everything that his eyes could see. Beside the three-legged cauldron, there was a figure that he was extremely familiar with hovering there and holding the three-legged cauldron. It was the heaven and earth creator, Luo Fan. Above the three-legged cauldron's suppressive power was boundless seawater, boundless waves, and boundless oceans. It was as if the suppressive power had separated the contact between the ocean and the island. No matter how intense the waves were, they couldn't really come into contact with the island, let alone injure it. At this moment, the previous incarnation was at the edge of the suppressive power, on the border that was about to come into contact with the suppressive power, but had yet to actually come into contact with it. After watching for a while, he couldn't help but retract his gaze. The suppressive power was extremely mysterious, and just looking at it would affect him. If he looked at it for a little longer, he would also be suppressed by the suppressive power, just like the perfect heaven and earth creator at this moment. Therefore, he could only watch for a while before retracting his gaze and waiting for the suppressive power to subside in his direction before he could look at it again. Chapter 2879. Looks like I'm really not suitable for advancing. In the end, the puzzled world founders came to such a conclusion. These world creators were easily satisfied and did not have much initiative in the first place. If that wasn't the case, why would they be so calm when so many founders of this world were tempted to explore that world? It was as if it had nothing to do with them. Clearly, the performance of the other world founders at this time had once again proven the dangers of advancing, but it made them further firmer in their beliefs. Safety first. There were not many worlds left in the transportation network layer, and there were at most tens of thousands of them. These worlds themselves were distributed in such a devastated transportation network layer, but they seemed a little lonely. Although these world founders believed in the concept of safety first, it was not because their senses were distorted. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine what they were thinking in the face of the devastated transportation network layer. Perhaps we should get rid of them all. At this moment, such a thought emerged in the minds of the remaining world founders. These world founders naturally communicated with each other. Even if they did not have much friendship before this, at this moment, when they were the only ones left in the entire transportation network layer, they would definitely unknowingly establish extremely deep friendships. In this way, they naturally agreed with each other very quickly. Removing the original world pioneers from the transport network layer had shrunk the scale of the transport network layer, but made it complete, making them feel comfortable. This was clearly a good thing for all the world pioneers who still existed in the transport network layer. However, it was obviously not difficult to remove the positions of the world founders. And this was because the transportation network layer had already passed the layer tribulation. And as the creator of the transportation network layer, Luo Fan, had already disappeared in the transportation network layer along with the world of laws. Without these two prerequisites, it would not be difficult, but impossible, to remove the positions of the pioneers of the world. At this moment, the world founders that still remained discussed with each other and worked hard to study the characteristics of the transportation network layer that still remained, trying their best to remove the vacancies left by them. The progress was so slow that it could even be said that it would take 1 trillion years for them to succeed. If this had happened to the other world founders, they might have given up on it. After all, it was just changing the scene of the traffic network layer. There was no real benefit to them at all. Spending billions of trillions of years on something like this was obviously not worth it. However, it was clear that this was only the opinion of the other world founders. For the world founders who prioritized safety above all else, such a safe and predictable goal could not be more perfect. Not to mention billions of trillion years. Even if it was millions of times longer, they would still gladly accept it. With their efforts, the entire transportation network layer seemed to be trembling slightly. In this trembling, all the roads in the transportation network layer were slightly distorted. Among them, the most intense tremors came from the ruptures of the nodes. That is the original location of those worlds that were separated from the transportation network layer. Of course, the tremors and distortions were not intense. At this rate, it would take billions of years for the tremors and distortions to completely mend the gaps. While the remaining pioneers in the transportation network layer were working hard to get rid of the other pioneers in the great world formed by the tribulation layer were looking around blankly. They were looking at the world that was rather familiar to them, or rather, the island. The reason why this world was rather familiar was very simple. It was because many of them had sent their clones into the world of laws. Although they eventually gave up on the clones they had sent into it, it was clear that before they gave up on the clones, they were still connected to the clones. Everything that the clones had experienced and seen was like what they had experienced and seen themselves. As for the world in front of them, it gave them the feeling that it was similar to the world that the incarnation had experienced in the law world. Perhaps it was more complete than the world that their clones had experienced back then. It was precisely because of this situation that this part of the world felt both familiar and foreign to them. Was everything we experienced before just an illusion? Some world founders murmured blankly. At this moment, they were a little doubtful if everything they had experienced was an illusion. Could it be that he had not explored that great world, but his senses had been distorted by the world of laws? In the end, he took the initiative to send his true body into the world of laws, turning himself into a fish on the chopping board. No one can do this and distort all of our senses. A world founder retorted when he heard this. His rebuttal was sonorous and forceful, but his heart was clearly not as firm as he appeared to be. This rebuttal was more to strengthen his confidence so that he would not be devoured by this terrifying possibility. This place isn't that world. At least, it's not the world that we have seen before. Suddenly, another world founder spoke. His words made most of the world progenitors look at him uncontrollably. Being stared at by so many world founders, the world founder could not help but feel an inexplicable pressure surging from the bottom of his heart. One must know that he did not have his own world now, and his current state was completely like his true body had descended. Most of the other world founders were not inferior to him. Under such circumstances, as long as he said something wrong and offended 1 in 10,000th of the world's founders, they would want to erase him. If that happened, the outcome that awaited him would not be pretty. With such pressure, unless the world founders completely disregarded life and death, it was impossible for there to be no abnormalities. However, since he had already said it, it was impossible for him to take back half of the words that he had said. At this moment, he just smiled faintly and said, "Don't you guys feel it? There are no parallel worlds in this world." Hearing this, many world founders were slightly stunned, and then their eyes lit up one after another. One must know that the original clones of many world founders had come into contact with the parallel worlds of laws. This also meant that the real world of laws should have a considerable number of parallel worlds. However, now that they were here, they did not feel any signs of the existence of parallel worlds at all. It was as if this world of laws was only what they saw in their eyes. And this was originally where the main body of the world of laws was. This situation either meant that the world of law had fallen back to the level of their world, or that this wasn't the world that they knew of. Obviously, if they were to believe that the world of laws would fall and degenerate again, they would be more willing to believe that this was no longer the world they knew. After all, if the world was going to degenerate, they could not imagine what kind of blow the world founders had to suffer for them to appear. If the creator of the world had suffered such a heavy blow, how could they still be here? Also, don't feel any traces of my clones, one of the world founders murmured. At this moment, the other world founders were also carefully sensing, looking for traces of their clones in this world of laws. One must know that the clones that they had abandoned had completely integrated into this world of laws, completely transforming into some kind of inseparable law, or perhaps law, in the world of laws. Under such circumstances, as long as this world was a world of laws, the traces that belonged to their clones would definitely exist. Even if the traces would be very different from their original clones, they would still exist. No matter how much they changed, there would still be traces of familiarity. But now, these world founders did not sense any traces of their clones at all. Was there a need to say what this meant? While the founders were carefully searching for their location, one of them suddenly cried out in surprise. "You're actually here." His voice was filled with anger, but there was also the joy of revenge. His words made the other world founders extend their senses in that direction. Very soon, furious and excited roars rang out one after another. "I've finally caught you." Many world founders gradually discovered the target that caused that existence to have such complicated emotions. That target was none other than a figure that they were extremely familiar with, but now seemed to have turned into a statue. It was the figure of a perfect world founder. Clearly, the range of the world founders was too wide, and in the end, one of them happened to be near the perfect world founder. Then, when he probed the surroundings, he discovered the existence of the perfect world founder. For these world founders who had been schemed against by the perfect world founder and unknowingly fell into this familiar, yet unfamiliar world, it was naturally self-evident how they would react when they saw the perfect world founder. Not long after, several figures appeared near the creator of the perfect world, and gazes filled with anger and hatred focused on the creator of the perfect world. Although they all wanted to tear the perfect world founder into pieces, these world founders had just been schemed against by the perfect world founder, so they naturally wouldn't act so rashly. At that moment, they surrounded the creator of the perfect world and carefully examined his situation. They wanted to know if this statue-like existence before them was really the creator of the perfect world and what his current situation was. They also wanted to know if attacking him would bring any danger to themselves. For the first point, it was not difficult for the world founders to determine if this statue-like figure was the perfect world founder. In fact, the performance of the first world founder who discovered the statue had already proved his judgment. However, for the second point, none of the world founders could be sure. At this moment, the perfect world founder's performance was simply too strange. He clearly had vitality, and his presence was clearly the same as before. However, they were unable to move at all. It was as if they had already merged with the world and turned into some sort of natural landscape. No matter what method they used to sense it, they could not find any flaws, nor could they sense any traces of the circulation of power. Under such circumstances, none of them dared to act rashly at this moment. "Looks like he's met with retribution," one of the world founders suddenly said, then turned around and left. Evidently, this was a world founder who believed that this state of the perfect world founder was the greatest punishment for him, and there was no need for him to continue attacking him. Following the actions of the world's founder, the other world's founders also split up. Some felt that they were not confident, some felt that this was already enough punishment like the world's founder, and some simply dispelled their hatred towards him. They immediately turned around and left one after another. In the blink of an eye, the number of world founders around the perfect world founder was reduced by a small half. The remaining world founders were clearly unwilling to give up. They still wanted to understand the situation of the perfect world founder before imposing further punishment on him. At this moment, above the void, at the boundary between the island and the suppressive force, the previous incarnation saw everything and had an indescribable look of admiration on his face. What he was admiring was naturally the many world founders who decisively left the perfect world founder. Chapter 2880. The flow of time in this world was completely independent from the flow of time in the other worlds in the simulated primal chaos. Countless years might have passed in the other worlds, but only a few days had passed in this world. Or perhaps only a few days had passed in the other worlds, but millions of years had passed in this world. It was even possible that a period of time had passed in this world, and the flow of time in the other worlds in the simulated primal chaos had even returned to the past. Due to this relatively independent characteristic, no matter how long this world had experienced, it had no connection to how long the cause of the changes had been brewing. In other words, to this world, the changes were happening at the same time, but to the worlds that had caused the changes, their flow of time might be extremely unsynchronized, and the time interval might even be hundreds of millions of years. It was just like the results of the various tests that had appeared in this world at the same time appeared in a short period of time. It was also as if the indescribable existences that had smashed into this world like raindrops. At this moment, countless mysterious existences smashed into this world in various ways. They were like shooting stars, undercurrents at the bottom of the sea, phantoms, or some kind of subtle distortion in time and space, or traces of strange living beings, or the shadows of certain islands, and so on and so forth. There were all sorts of strange things that were almost beyond the imagination of living beings. These existences entered this world in different ways, but for this world, the flow of time was almost synchronized, and their fates were almost the same. All existences that entered this world were completely devoured and fused with this world, making this world even more mysterious and wondrous. This world, which had originally been a boundless ocean, was now densely packed with hundreds of millions of islands that could no longer be ignored. Every single one of these islands was insignificant compared to this world. In terms of size, they could almost be completely ignored. However, it was just like a black dot on a piece of white paper. If it was just a single black dot, it would naturally be easy to ignore. However, once the number of black dots increased to a certain extent, then this piece of white paper could no longer be called a piece of white paper. Instead, it would become a piece of dusty paper. At this moment, the countless densely packed islands that appeared in this world were like black dots on that piece of white paper. Because there were simply too many of them, in the end, they completely changed the appearance of this world. At this moment, compared to the former incarnation and the other creators from the transportation network layer who only paid attention to the situation inside this world that was suspected of being a perfect world of laws, or rather, their perspective could only be limited to the interior of this world that was suspected of being a perfect world of laws. Luo Fan, who was the creator of the world of laws, directly looked at the overall situation. He had never set his sights on individual islands, or rather, on individual worlds. From the very beginning, he had set his sights on the entire world as a whole. At this moment, the changes that had occurred in this world were naturally seen by him. After seeing this clearly, he already had some other guesses about the reason why the numerous existences with different forms appeared at the same time that smashed into this world just now. Perhaps it's because they're all equally powerless to this world, so they appear at the same time. Those changes with different manifestations, even if they start at the same time, will not appear in this world at the same time, but will choose another time. At this time, such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. For a moment, he had a better understanding of this world. This world was formed by the tribulation layer, and the one guiding this transformation was the incarnation of the will that was suspected to be the tribulation layer or the state of chaos. Only such an incarnation of the will could cause such an incredible change in the entire tribulation layer, transforming it from a state where the power of the tribulations wreaked havoc into an incomparably vast and great world. And the fundamental purpose of creating such a world was obviously to deal with him. Or to be more specific, it was to deal with the three-legged cauldron that he had condensed with the help of the power related to the true sage. At this moment, the suppression power released by his three-legged cauldron was still almost absolute relative to the surrounding world, and it could completely suppress all changes in this world within its scope of effect. Even the boundless terrifying waves in the outside world would be suppressed at the same time after entering a certain range, causing all destructive power to disappear. However, this range could only be limited to the surroundings of the world that was suspected to be a perfect world of laws at this moment. In other words, it was limited to the surroundings of the island that was the source of all the turbulence and rejection in this world. Within this range, the three-legged cauldron's power was indeed almost absolute. It was enough for Luo Fan to obtain the greatest victory. However, all of these victories were only limited to this extremely small area compared to this part of the world. Outside this range, in the boundless world, everything was still under the absolute control of the incarnation of the will. Now, the various changes in this world, and even the various results caused by the incarnation of the perfect world, could be said to be the result of the incarnation of the will. In other words, it could be said that the island he was on, or rather, the world he was on, had transformed into a world of perfect laws, and it could be said to have been indirectly caused by the incarnation of the will. Everything, including the growth of the island itself, the transformation from a perfect state that had been distorted by the worldview of laws to its current state, where it seemed to have grown tremendously and even integrated with the many creators of the world, and so on and so forth. All the changes that seemed to be of great benefit to the island were the indirect results of the incarnation of the will. Luo Fan still didn't know the purpose of the incarnation of the will, but he knew that the incarnation of the will was definitely not an existence that did good deeds without leaving its name. This was especially so when he was already standing on the opposite side. The changes that seemed to have many benefits to him must have hidden dangers, or it might even be a trap. It was precisely because of this that he did not allow this world to evolve at this moment. He did not directly let the world founders, the perfect world founders, or even the various resources brought by the incarnation of the will to truly transform into the potential of his island. Instead, he let the three-legged cauldron that was formed by the power related to the true divine cover the entire world, and at the same time, this world was also under the suppression of that power. Of course, this was his own world after all, and it was closely related to him, so the suppression method was naturally different from the suppression method he used on other things. Therefore, although the living beings in this world were suppressed, he did not feel too much, and it was as if all their activities were not suppressed. At this moment, the various situations in this world made him feel like a storm was brewing, as if the incarnation of the will was brewing a huge move against him. However, although he could confront the incarnation of the will with the help of the three-legged cauldron, preventing the incarnation of the will from directly interfering with the island he was on, and even if it wanted to accomplish something, it could only rely on indirect methods. After all, it was only relying on the three-legged cauldron. Moreover, the real power that exerted its power was the power related to the true divine. Although the three-legged cauldron could release an unimaginable supreme suppression power due to its structure, in fact, the power that belonged to the power related to the true divine was only an insignificant part of it. This way of using that power could only be regarded as a crude way of using it. In fact, it could not even be considered as truly flexible use of the power related to the true divine. Under such circumstances, he was now facing the incarnation of the will that could change the entire tribulation level at will, and even indirectly mobilize the power of the entire simulated state of chaos. How many other ways could he have? One side could use the power of the simulated state of chaos at will, while the other side could not even mobilize the power that it relied on. It was already self-evident who was stronger and who was weaker in the confrontation between the two. At this moment, although Luo Fan could feel the atmosphere of the storm, there was nothing he could do, and he could only wait for everything to happen vigilantly. Of course, he had the most fundamental way to break out of this predicament, and that was to strengthen his control of the power related to the true divine. If he could control that power perfectly, it would be a piece of cake for him to break out of this simulated state of chaos and completely transcend. At that time, it would be equivalent to him surviving the seventh Great Tribulation. However, it was obvious that he would not be able to do this even if he advanced a few more realms and reached the level of a nine tribulations powerhouse. After all, that was a power related to the true divine. Such a power itself contained a certain mystery related to the true divine. If not, it would not be able to face the simulated state of chaos that was countless times larger than it. The mystery related to the true divine was obviously not something that could be fully understood by those who had not reached the true divine level. If one could not understand the mystery of a certain thing, it would simply be a fool's dream to want to completely control that thing. Therefore, if one worked hard in this direction, it could be said that one was destined to fail. Lamenting in his heart, Luo Fan shifted the gaze of his incarnation from the entire world outside to the special area in the center of the island. From the perspective of an island, this core region was naturally located at the center of the island, the core of the core. Still, if one were to look at it from the perspective of the world, the core region was hidden in layers of dimensions, parallel time, parallel space, and even a certain bizarre dimension where everything else was located in the depths of the universe. That's right. Although the creators of the world believed that there were no more parallel universes in this world and believed that there were no traces of their incarnations here, in fact, that was only because they were suppressed by the three-legged cauldron. In fact, all the parallel universes still existed in this world. In fact, because of the existence of that perfect quality, the connection between him and the main body of this world became even closer and more mysterious. In that core area, his main body, along with the power related to the true divine, seemed to have existed since time immemorial, quietly waiting there. At this moment, his main body also opened his eyes and looked at the incarnation, directly connecting with the eyes of the incarnation. For a moment, an unknown amount of information was exchanged between the main body and the incarnation through this gaze. It must be known that this incarnation had always been Luo Fan's incarnation and had always had a close connection with him. However, in fact, this incarnation and the main body were still separated by the power related to the true divine, and were even separated by countless space-time and countless possibilities. Under such circumstances, the information exchange between the main body and the incarnation would ultimately be somewhat disrupted. This interference would not allow the incarnation to become independent, but it would cause the thoughts of the incarnation, the will of the incarnation, the information that the incarnation received, and the new information that was born in the depths of the incarnation's heart to be unable to be transmitted to the main body in absolute synchronization. Similarly, the various comprehensions, experiences, and improvements of the main body could not be transmitted to the incarnation at the same time. As a result, the strange exchange of information between the clone and the main body became necessary at this moment. There's actually such a huge difference. After this exchange, the main body and the incarnation had the same thought at the same time. Through this exchange, both of them confirmed one thing at the same time, and that was the difference in thinking between the main body and the incarnation was actually much greater than he had imagined. Chapter 2881. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan instantly came to a realization. This must be one of the reasons why the incarnation of the will had done so many things before. To think that it would use such a method, it's indeed not easy to deal with. He thought to himself, as he became even more wary of the incarnation of the will. Cutting off the connection between his main body and his clone was clearly an effective way to bypass the suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron. After all, if this kind of separation continued, there would come a day when the connection between his original body and his avatar would be completely severed. At that time, this avatar, which was entrusted with the power related to a true divine, would naturally stand on the opposite side of his original body. In other words, he would stand on the side of the incarnation of the will. In that case, the three-legged cauldron would no longer be a threat to the incarnation of the will, and it would become a force on his side. Once this happened, the existence that was currently protecting Luo Fan would naturally turn around and attack Luo Fan. In that case, the confrontation between Luo Fan and the incarnation of the will would naturally collapse on its own. As expected, I can't even relax for a moment. After a while, Luo Fan sighed with emotion again. He tried his best to strengthen the connection between his main body and his doppelganger. He tried his best to eliminate the barrier between his main body and his doppelganger that had appeared because of the changes that had occurred on this island. If he did not discover this barrier, it would naturally continue to grow, and in the end, it would completely sever the connection between his main body and his clone, allowing his clone to gain independence. However, once he discovered the existence of this barrier, it would no longer be a problem for him. Currently, he could already re-establish a connection just by looking at his main body and his clone and bypass the barrier that was constantly growing stronger. Moreover, this was just a method of communication that he had casually constructed. For Luo Fan, if he wanted to, he could establish a method of communication that was countless times more exquisite than the one he had imagined, and connect his main body with his clone. At this moment, with a thought, various indescribable undulations were inserted into the power related to the true divine. With the help of the connection between the power related to the true divine, he transmitted the undulations to his clone and established an almost unbreakable undulation connection with his clone. With the establishment of this connection, the connection between his main body and his clone was greatly strengthened. In the blink of an eye, his main body and his clone had already fused into one again, and the invisible barrier between them had been completely broken. Sensing that the extremely close connection had been re-established, Luo Fan slightly breathed a sigh of relief. Of course, it was only slightly, although he had already strengthened the connection between his main body and his avatar. He knew very well that cutting off the connection between his main body and his avatar was definitely not the only reason for the avatars to cause the various changes on this island. As the will incarnation that was suspected to simulate the state of chaos, it was at least in existence at the tribulation level. How could the will incarnation's methods be so simple? To him, any action would definitely have a sufficiently deep meaning, and any action would definitely lead to a large number of results that were beneficial to him. Isolating the connection between the clone and the main body seemed to be heaven-defying enough, but if it was used on the incarnation of the will, this reason seemed a little weak. Therefore, it was inevitable that it would have a deeper plan to cause all these changes. If he ignored it, it would definitely lead to even more serious consequences. At this time, Luo Fan was extremely vigilant in his heart. He carefully examined himself from top to bottom, inside and outside, probing the various subtle connections between himself and the island, as well as the various changes that had taken place on the island and the development trend in the future. The incarnation of the will would definitely have a deeper intention and more plans. However, judging from the direction of the plan to cut off the connection between his main body and his clone, the incarnation of the will was probably targeting the interior of the three-legged cauldron's suppressive power. After all, compared to the battle within the suppressive power, it was much more difficult to break through the protection of the three-legged cauldron's suppressive power and attack the existence within it from the outside. In the face of such a situation, the many other plans of the incarnation of the will were most likely aimed at the various existences within the suppressive power. Even at this moment, Luo Fan did not know what the direction of the incarnation of the will was, nor did he know what effect it wanted to achieve in the end. However, it was obviously not wrong to be vigilant. At this moment, the power related to the true saint was still the same as before, and it did not respond to any changes in the outside world. It was like an eternally motionless dead object, completely ignoring all changes in the outside world. It was as if all the changes in the outside world were insignificant to it. At this moment, there seemed to be no difference between the core of the perfect world of laws, and even the depths of the tribulation level. At this moment, the perception of Luo Fan's main body was still dragged into the power, and it was still outlined in an extremely complicated formation within the power. It was tightly locked with the power, and it could not be shaken at all, let alone escape. From a certain point of view, this kind of locking could also be considered a kind of protection. After all, the perception was locked with the power related to the true saint. In that case, if he wanted to destroy the perception, he would first have to destroy the power that was locking onto the perception. At the very least, he would have to separate the perception from the power related to the true saint. Obviously, either of these two methods was extremely difficult. It was the same for the simulated chaotic state. It could be said that although it was not absolutely impossible, with such a precaution, the safety of Luo Fan's perception was already guaranteed to a considerable extent. For the current Luo Fan, even if his true body was destroyed and completely erased, he would definitely be able to recover in an instant as long as he had this perception. It would be as if he hadn't suffered any injuries and wouldn't be affected in the slightest. With such a guarantee, logically speaking, Luo Fan would be able to provoke the simulated chaotic state without any restrictions, and even let the incarnation of the will carry out all kinds of schemes and plans against him. However, it was obvious that such a negative choice would never happen to Luo Fan. If that was the case, wouldn't he have to exist in his seventh major tribulation forever? Even for him, there was still cultivation and improvement everywhere. There wasn't much difference between cultivating in the simulated chaotic state created by the seventh major tribulation and cultivating in the real chaotic state. However, there was a fatal weakness in the simulated chaotic state created by the seventh major tribulation, which made it impossible for him to stay here forever. That was, if he couldn't survive the seventh major tribulation, he wouldn't be able to trigger the eighth or ninth major tribulation, and he wouldn't be able to become a true saint. Perhaps, in the simulated chaotic state created by the seventh major tribulation, the improvement he could get would be limited. Under such circumstances, he might be able to stay in the simulated chaotic state for a relatively long period of time, like in any other place, such as in the Tao Master's Road, or in the land of opportunities in the chaotic state, or even directly cultivating in a certain chaotic layer. However, that period of time would definitely be limited. Even if this period of time was billions of trillions of years, or even billions of trillions of trillions of trillions of years, it was impossible for this period of time to turn into an eternity. Obviously, once he chose to allow the power related to true saint to protect his perception and his last chance of survival, then he would completely lose the possibility of transcending the simulated chaotic state and getting rid of the seventh major tribulation. And this also meant that even if he could get the best result, he would have to live here for an infinite period of time. Therefore, even with this last guarantee, Luo Fan had never thought of using this guarantee to give up fighting against the incarnation of the will. Moreover, this kind of final guarantee was not too absolute. First of all, the two ways to break it were not absolute. At the level of the simulated chaotic state, it was naturally impossible to completely destroy this power related to true saint. However, who could guarantee that this power related to true saint would never change? Who could guarantee that the power related to the true divine would exist here forever and would not disappear? Perhaps the power related to the true divine would suddenly disappear without a trace. Although the possibility was not high, no one could guarantee that it would not happen. In addition, Luo Fan's perception and the lock of this power were not really unbreakable. At this time, Luo Fan couldn't even describe how mysterious the simulated chaotic state was. Who knew when it would give rise to some kind of change that could dispel his perception and this power's lock? Perhaps this possibility was as small as the previous possibility, but no one could prove that this possibility would not happen. Obviously, it was impossible for Luo Fan to bet his fate on this possibility. Secondly, this power that was related to the true divine was not completely harmless. Perhaps this power related to true saint did not care about Luo Fan at all and could even provide some protection for him through his efforts. However, all of this was obviously not the true intention of that power. This situation was created by Luo Fan through various ingenious means. At most, this power did not resist at all. No one could feel how much kindness it had for Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, who knew when this power would suddenly react and directly attack Luo Fan? Although based on the current state of the power that was related to the true divine, the possibility of this happening was not high. However, it was obvious that this possibility existed. It would be fine if it did not happen, but once it did, wouldn't Luo Fan not be able to cry even if he wanted to? In fact, even now, the second danger still existed. If there was a way, Luo Fan would never be willing to pin his life on the second danger not appearing. However, it was obvious that because of a moment of carelessness, his current perception had been locked with the power related to true saint. Even if he wanted to get rid of it now, he could not. Hence, for the time being, he could only accept this result. At this moment, Luo Fan carefully sensed everything, and everything on the island that was like a perfect world of laws was completely unfolded in his mind. The suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron was unimaginably powerful and mysterious. Under this suppressive force, all the developments on this island were completely under Luo Fan's control. If he wanted it to be stagnant, it could only be stagnant in that state. For example, the many possibilities on the island were currently hovering between existence and non-existence under the suppressive force. This was also the fundamental reason why the creators of the world couldn't discover those possibilities, or rather, the existence of those parallel existences. Otherwise, given the perception abilities of the creators of the world, how could they not sense the existence of their incarnations at all? How could they have made such a wrong judgment before? At this moment, countless possibilities had already unfolded in Luo Fan's mind. The countless possibilities from the beginning to the present, and even the future developments were unreservedly revealed in his mind. There were so many changes involved, and the amount of information involved was so great that it even exceeded the limits of what could be described with numbers. If it weren't for this incomparably mysterious suppressive force suppressing everything, even Luo Fan would have been stunned for a long time because of the countless changes and the endless amount of information. But now, under Luo Fan's will, the information and the endless changes were accepted by him in a way that he could easily bear. This world was the product of the fusion of the perfect characteristic that had been distorted by the world of laws. It could be said that it was also the appearance of the world of laws after it was imitated by the chaotic state and endowed with the perfect characteristic. It wasn't inaccurate to say that it was a perfect world of laws. Chapter 2882. An ordinary perfect world should be a world that had passed through the 7 great tribulations of the heavens and the earth that could naturally descend from the state of chaos. When a world had reached the limit that the world could endure and could no longer advance, only then would it trigger a certain subtle mechanism that simulated the state of chaos. In the end, only then would the characteristic of perfection descend and fuse with the world, causing the world to become a perfect world. A world like this was obviously a world that had gone through 7 great tribulations. At this time, Luo Fan's world was obviously not satisfied with this premise. At the very most, Luo Fan's world of laws was only equivalent to passing 3 great tribulations. Although Luo Fan's worldview was quite mysterious and more perfect than ordinary worldviews, his world of laws wasn't any weaker than an ordinary world of laws that had gone through the 7th great tribulation of the world. It didn't mean that he hadn't gone through the remaining 4 great tribulations. In that case, the 4 huge benefits that could be obtained from the simulated chaos state would naturally no longer exist as a result. Such a deficiency caused the world of laws to actually not reach the strongest realm that it could reach in the simulated state of chaos. In other words, under normal circumstances, if the world of laws continued to develop like a normal world in the simulated state of chaos, then the level it could reach in the end would definitely be higher than what it was now. In that case, once the world of laws naturally obtained the perfect characteristic, not only would the perfect characteristic be incomparably compatible with the world of laws, but the blessing that it would receive would also probably be many times stronger than it was now. Of course, all of this was obviously not something that Luo Fan could choose to do. He had gone from being a normal creator of the world in the transportation network layer to finally standing on the opposite side of the simulated chaos state. Everything was the result of the interaction of many factors. In this way, even if he had known this a long time ago, he would still have been pushed to this step by the situation, of course, although he wasn't very satisfied with the level of his world of laws at this time. Luo Fan was actually quite clear that this might not be a bad thing. After all, he still had to stand on the opposite side of the simulated chaos state. In the end, he still had to break through the simulated chaos state and complete transcendence. In this case, he would be able to obtain a lot of benefits from the simulated chaos state. Although he didn't see any problems for the time being, it was still a hidden danger. Who knew if there were any back doors or hidden loopholes among the many benefits of simulating the chaotic state? Of course, this did not mean that Luo Fan's previous actions were not dangerous. After all, he had been communicating with the simulated chaos at all times ever since he had stepped into it. His world of laws had also been created from the simulated chaos. Everything he comprehended from the world of laws ultimately came from simulating the state of chaos. In this way, even if he completely abandoned the simulated chaotic state and stepped into the tribulation level to directly comprehend the various secrets of the tribulation level, he still didn't completely get rid of the possibility of backdoors and hidden dangers being planted in the simulated chaotic state. Now, although the world of law didn't absorb the benefits it could obtain from the last 4 great tribulations and didn't directly absorb the perfect characteristics that simulated the state of chaos that naturally targeted the world of law, it still couldn't completely avoid the existence of backdoors and hidden dangers. After all, the world of law had already obtained benefits 3 times. It was just that the more it obtained, the greater the possibility of backdoors and hidden dangers being planted in it. As for how to measure it, it would depend on one's own judgment. For Luo Fan, the current situation wasn't perfect, but it was still barely acceptable. Normally speaking, this kind of perfect characteristic should be safer than before. There must be many backdoors or hidden dangers, and it should be unlikely for them to erupt before the power completely gives up on this perfect characteristic. Luo Fan thought to himself as he secretly sensed the information about the world of laws that flowed into his heart at his extreme speed. Due to the existence of the supreme suppressive force released by the 3-legged cauldron, he could not only choose the speed at which he received the information, but he could also choose the content of the information. Therefore, even though the amount of information was beyond imagination, and it would normally take him hundreds of trillions of years to receive it at such a speed, he was still confident that he could finish receiving the information in an acceptable amount of time. After all, the suppressive force itself was the best information filter. It was enough to filter out unimportant information that had nothing to do with the direction he was concerned about, so as to prevent him from receiving too much useless information. After being filtered by the suppressive force, it still took Luo Fan thousands of years to finish receiving the large amount of information. Of course, with the existence of the suppressive force, this period of time might be less than an instant compared to the time outside the world of laws. After all, this suppressive force could even suppress time. So the flow of time inside the world of laws was naturally completely independent of the flow of time in all other areas. There are a lot more discordant things that shouldn't have appeared. After experiencing it for a while, Luo Fan couldn't help but be surprised and overjoyed. After all, this island, or rather, the world of laws, was formed by the distortion and fusion of the perfect characteristic of the world of laws and another world of laws. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for the world of laws and the perfect characteristic to be perfectly compatible with each other. It was like a ball that was squeezed out of thin air. No matter how dexterous one was, the ball couldn't be a perfect ball. Therefore, the distorted perfect characteristic was naturally somewhat different from the perfect characteristic that the world of laws could obtain from the simulated state of chaos if it developed normally. These differences were where most of the discordant things were. In addition, the perfect characteristic itself was aimed at the world of laws that had undergone 7 great tribulations, while the world of laws itself had only undergone 3 great tribulations. The difference in the number of great tribulations was another source of discordant things. All these discordant things intertwined with each other, and the final result was that there were many discordant things in the world of laws at this moment. Although these discordant areas caused the world of laws to be filled with hidden dangers and greatly increased the danger, it was also a breakthrough point. It was a breakthrough point to deal with the incarnation of the will behind the world of laws. It was precisely because of this that his expression was so strange and complicated at this moment. At this moment, some subtle changes suddenly appeared in the surrounding ocean out of nowhere. This incomparably great world of laws was completely born from the tribulations, and everything in it was formed from the power of the tribulations. At this moment, the origin of the many islands that appeared in this boundless ocean-like world was the world created by the creators of the world. Perhaps it would go through all kinds of distortions, transformations, and even all kinds of incredible changes, but this essence couldn't be changed. Under such circumstances, everything that was originally in this world would naturally reject all the islands, including the island that was suppressed by the power of suppression. In this way, the boundless waves around the island repelled and scoured the surrounding island, which was obviously an incomparably natural phenomenon. But at this moment, when this subtle change appeared, the rejection of the island by the seawater that covered the entire world actually began to weaken unknowingly. It was as if the irreconcilable contradiction between the two had been gradually reconciled. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan immediately felt it. An indescribable vigilance emerged in his heart. He wasn't sure where the incarnation of the will was now, but he knew that everything in this world was now under the absolute control of the incarnation of the will. The sudden weakening of the repelling effect was obviously the result of the incarnation of the will. What was the incarnation of the will going to do now? What the incarnation of the will was going to do now was to deal with him. Under such circumstances, the changes in front of him were obviously dangerous to him that he hadn't discovered yet. Knowing this, how could he not be vigilant? What exactly is it trying to do? At this moment, he raised his head and looked out. His eyes seemed to penetrate the barrier of infinite space and time, and he saw the incarnation of the will hidden in the depths of this world. At this moment, in the perfect world of laws, the many creators of the world had already begun to take action against the creator of the perfect world. It was as if there was an inexplicable impulse that was pushing them to take action. Of course, this impulse was extremely weak. Even the many creators of the world couldn't sense the unnaturalness of the impulse. At most, they felt that it was just a whim. There was no need to mention the means of the founders. Every single one of them was an existence that could create a new world. Their strength was not something that ordinary cultivators could compare to, and the number of means they had was not something that ordinary cultivators could imagine. At this moment, they joined forces. In an instant, the entire perfect world of laws seemed to have become much dimmer, and it seemed as if the world was faintly shaking. There were countless means and all kinds of strange means. Some were brilliance, some were light, some were waves, some were invisible and intangible, and some were simply magic treasures, weapons, and other objects. If ordinary cultivators joined forces like this, it would definitely end up in an uncontrollable mess. However, at this moment, the ones who joined forces to attack were not ordinary cultivators, but the world creators. Even if they didn't agree on how to cooperate, the means they used in the end wouldn't have too much direct conflict with the other world creators. In the end, even if there were all kinds of strange means that seemed to have a strong conflict with each other, there would definitely be some points that were compatible with other means. And the other world creators would definitely be able to grasp these points of compatibility as well. In this way, the various means that should have been extremely chaotic finally gathered together, but it didn't seem chaotic at all. Instead, it was extremely subtle, and there was an inexplicable sense of harmony. These countless methods drowned the perfected heaven and earth creator, who was like a statue. There were countless methods, and some of them were completely ineffective against the perfect world creators. However, with so many methods, even the crudest of them, there would definitely be some that hit the mark and coincided with certain laws and could be effective against the perfect world creators. Moreover, these means were definitely not crudely used, and every single one of them was indescribably exquisite. At that moment, the perfect creator of the world, who was like a statue, had his defenses broken through by countless means and brazenly penetrated into his body. It began to affect his body from many directions, causing destruction. Crack, crack. A strange sound rang out from the body of the perfect heaven and earth creator. Hearing that sound, many of the world creators rejoiced inwardly. It was clear that the grand perfection world creator could no longer endure the attacks and was on the verge of collapsing and being destroyed. To the world creators, this was clearly the result that they wanted. However, before the world creators could smile, their expressions changed drastically as they couldn't believe what they were feeling. Soon after, an unimaginable suppressive force appeared from the world creator's body in the blink of an eye. Before the world creators could even react, it had already enveloped them, causing them to be completely stunned. Just like the world creator from before, it was so much so that the countless means that they had released earlier were suppressed along with them.